Kang Do-hyun lay face down in the wet sand, coughing so hard it felt as if his ribs would crack. A wave washed over him and then receded. He rolled onto his back. The sky didn't look right. Too blue, too clear. Not a single trace of a plane, not a single cloud. Just the sun, burning as if it wanted to push him back into the sand. He raised his hand and looked at his fingers. His skin was wrinkled from the water. There was a mark on his wrist where his watch had been, but the watch itself was gone. He sat up. His head spun. His mouth was full of sand and salt. He spat and looked around. The beach, a wide, white beach stretching as far as the eye could see to the left and right. Behind him, a wall of jungle so dense it seemed like a single living organism. Trees as tall as a high-rise building, vines as thick as an arm. The air was so humid that every breath felt like breathing through a wet rag. Do-hyun got to his feet. His knees buckled, but he steadied himself. Something was pressing against him in his shirt pocket. He reached in and pulled out a folding knife. His grandfather's knife. The very one the old man had placed in his palm a week before his death, saying he would still need it. The blade was covered with reddish spots of rust. The spring was sticking. The tip was broken off. Do-hyun. He ran his thumb along the spine. Carbon steel. Judging by the color of the rust and the texture of the chip, it had happened a long time ago. Visually, the hardness was about 58 on the Rockwell scale, maybe 60. The geometry of the edge was ruined, but the bevels were intact. If he could find a flat, coarse-grained stone for rough grinding and something fine for finishing, he could restore a usable edge in a couple of hours. Not ideal, but it would cut. He closed the knife and clenched it in his fist. It was the only thing he had left from his former world. Far off to the right, along the beach, smoke was rising, a gray column against a green wall, a campfire. That meant people. Do-hyun headed toward the smoke. The sand was hot and burned his feet through his wet boots. He had to walk for about 20 minutes. The smoke grew thicker. Then he heard voices, rough male voices speaking English, laughter, the clang of metal. He stepped out from behind a fallen palm tree trunk and saw the camp, about 30 people on a small patch of land stretching along the shore, tents sewn from canvas, campfires in pits, barrels and scraps of planks pulled out of the water. The people were dirty and thin, their clothes hung in tatters, but they had weapons, several knives, axes, and 2 pistols in leather holsters on the belt of a broad-shouldered man who stood in the center, gesturing with his hand as he gave orders. The bosun. Do-hyun realized this immediately from his bearing and the way the others lowered their eyes when he looked at them. Do-hyun stepped closer. 2 men by the farthest campfire noticed him first. One stood up and blocked his path. He was a head taller than Do-hyun and twice as broad. He asked who he was and where he was from. Do-hyun replied that he had been washed ashore, that he had been on a plane. The man exchanged a glance with the other. They didn't understand the word plane. Do-hyun hesitated. He looked more closely. The clothes these people were wearing were old, not dirty, but old in style. Shirts with high collars, pants held up by suspenders, boots with buckles. He looked at the debris of planks by the water. These weren't the wreckage of a modern vessel. They were frames, the wooden ribs of a ship sheathed with copper plates. A sailing ship. A sailing ship had crashed here. Do-hyun felt the ground shift beneath his feet, not from weakness. It was from realization. He didn't know where he'd ended up, but this wasn't his world, nor was it his time. The bosun approached him, a burly man with a sunburned face and a red beard with crumbs stuck in it. He eyed Do-hyun from head to toe. He asked if he had a weapon. Do-hyun showed him a folding knife. The bosun took it between 2 fingers, twirled it, and tossed it back. He said it wasn't a weapon, just a scrap of metal. He asked what Do-hyun could do. Do-hyun replied that he was an engineer, that he worked with metal. The The bosun smirked. He said he didn't need engineers. He needed hands that could chop wood and legs that could run faster than the beasts at night. And if Do-hyun had neither, then he should keep walking down the beach and not eat someone else's food. Do-hyun stood there looking at him. Then he shifted his gaze to the axe in the hands of the man standing nearby. The blade was jagged, the handle was cracked and wrapped in a strip of cloth. The angle of the blade was wrong. With every swing, the axe would twist and sap his strength. Do-hyun saw this as clearly as if someone had drawn a diagram for him right in the air. He knew the grain of this steel. He knew that the cutting edge had been overheated during the initial forging and was therefore crumbling. He knew that the handle shouldn't be repaired, but replaced entirely and set at a different angle because the man was left-handed and the axe was mounted for a right-handed user. He didn't understand where this knowledge came from. Before, he could determine many things by eye, but not like this, not with such precision, not with such confidence. It was as if the island had revealed something to him, as if his hands had begun to sense what his eyes could not see. The bosun repeated that he should leave. Do-hyun turned around and walked back along the beach. He didn't argue, he didn't beg, he didn't grovel. He walked and thought. He needed a stone, a flat one with a rough surface. Sandstone would do, or basalt if he could find a grainy one. He turned toward the surf line where the waves were washing stones out of the sand. 10 minutes later, he found what he was looking for. A flat piece of gray stone about the size of his palm, coarse-grained. It would be enough for rough shaping. Then he found a second one, smaller and smoother. It'll do for finishing touches. Not Arkansas, of course, but there's no Arkansas here, and there never will be. He walked about 300 meters away from camp. He found a spot where the beach abutted a rocky outcrop. On one side was a cliff, on the other the jungle. Between them was a patch of sand about 5 by 5 meters, rocks all around, a log washed ashore by the waves. The wind carried the scent of fresh water from the jungle to this spot. There was a stream somewhere nearby. Do-hyun sat down on the sand, leaned his back against a rock, and opened his knife. The spring creaked, the blade stood crooked. He placed it on his knee and began to work. The stone settled comfortably in his left hand. His right hand held the knife at a 15-degree angle to the surface. He ran the blade across the stone in even strokes, counting the passes. 10 on one side, 10 on the other. Check with his finger. A burr had formed. That meant the angle was right. Switch to a smaller stone. Remove the burr. Check. 3 more passes. 2 more. He worked, and the world around him faded away. There was no beach, no jungle, no enemy camp. There was only metal and stone, the movement of his hand, and the quiet sound of steel against grit. 2 hours later, the knife was ready. Not perfect. The tip was still chipped and couldn't be repaired without reforging, but the edge was sharp enough to use. He cut a strip of fabric from his shirt sleeve. The cut was clean. The blade glided through easily. Do-hyun nodded to himself. Now he had a knife. Now he needed a fire. He stood up and walked toward the jungle to find some dry wood. He found a stream 20 paces from his little clearing, a thin trickle of clear water seeping from beneath a rock and flowing into the sand. Do-hyun drank his fill. The water was cold and sweet after the salt. He gathered some dry branches. He thinned shavings with his knife. He didn't have a tinderbox, but he found a piece of flint among the rocks on the beach. 3 strikes of the knife's flat side against the flint. A spark. The shavings began to smolder. He fanned the flames with his palms. Morning came with the cries of birds. The jungle came alive at once, as if the night had never happened. Do-hyun unclenched his fingers from the knife's handle. His hand was cramping. He struggled to straighten his fingers and looked at the campfire. The embers were still smoldering. He was sitting in the same position as he had been the night before. His back was stiff. He couldn't turn his neck. But he was alive. That in itself was an achievement. He stood up. His legs buckled, and he grabbed a rock to keep from falling. His body felt heavy and foreign after a sleepless night. He walked over to the stream and dipped his face into the water. The cold stung his skin, and his thoughts grew clearer. He needed shelter, not a campfire, but walls, something he could close off for the night. Do-hyun looked around. His little spot between the cliff and the jungle was good because it already had natural protection on two sides. A rocky ledge on the left, a dense wall of trees behind him. All that remained was to cover the front and the right side. He walked along the edge of the jungle and began cutting bamboo. The knife worked well. The blade held up. Stalks as thick as 2 fingers fell after 3 to 4 cuts. In an hour, he had cut 20 stalks, each 2 meters long. Then he began to weave a frame. Without rope, this would have been impossible, but he found vines, thin and flexible. He cut them down and soaked them in the stream to soften them. Then he tied the bamboo stalks together into a lattice, one wall, then another. By noon, he had 3 woven panels, which he leaned against a rock and tied together. The result was a shelter, crooked, full of gaps, with holes big enough for a cat to squeeze through. But it was something. He climbed inside and sat down. It was cramped inside and smelled of damp wood. There was no roof. He looked up. The sky was too far away to count as a ceiling. He'd make a roof tomorrow. Right now, he needed a door. He stepped outside and began weaving a 4th panel. This one was already done. He made loops out of vines on it and tied it to the left wall so that it could open and close. It wasn't a door. It was the idea of a door. But even the idea of a door was better than nothing. He stood there looking at his structure. The professional part of his brain wanted to tear it all down and start over. The bamboo was damp and would start to rot in a week. The vines would stretch out. The corners were uneven. But the other part of his brain, the one responsible for survival, said that was enough for today. He was so hungry his stomach was growling. The last time he'd eaten was on the plane. He didn't know how much time had passed since then. He grabbed a knife and headed into the jungle. Carefully, looking over his shoulder at every step. It was safe here during the day. He'd seen people from the big camp go into the jungle for water and firewood. But he didn't know what was safe to eat here and what wasn't. 10 minutes later, he found a tree bearing fruit, round green balls the size of a fist. He picked one and cut it open. Inside was white flesh with a sharp, sour smell. He didn't take the risk. He put it in his pocket and kept going. He found some bushes with small, dark berries. There were bird tracks and droppings nearby. If birds eat them, they can't be deadly. He picked 3 berries and popped them into his mouth, sour and astringent, but edible. He filled his pockets. He returned to the campsite. He built a fire. He ate the berries and washed them down with water from the stream. His hunger hadn't gone away, but it had become more bearable. Then he heard footsteps, heavy footsteps on the sand. 2 men from the large camp emerged from behind a rocky outcrop. One was carrying something wrapped in a rag over his shoulder. The other walked with his hands in his pockets, grinning. They approached his campfire and stopped. The first man unwrapped the rag and tossed an axe at Do-hyun's feet. That very one, with a cracked handle and a jagged blade. The man said the bosun had told him to pass on a message. If the engineer was so smart, let him fix it. If the axe was working by evening, maybe they'd let him go to the boiler room for a bowl of soup. If not, let him keep munching on his berries. They left. Do-hyun picked up the axe. He took it in his hands and felt it again. It was as if his fingers had become a scanner. The steel of the blade was uneven. The left side was softer than the right, overheating during forging. The tempering had been done incorrectly. The steel grain was coarse and brittle in one spot and fine and tough in another. The axe handle was made of ash. It was good wood, but there was a crack running along the grain and it couldn't be repaired. It had to be replaced. The blade angle was 20 degrees, the standard for right-handers, but the bosun was left-handed. Do-hyun had seen him chop at the air with his hand when giving orders with his left hand, and with every swing the axe veered off to the side because the geometry didn't suit his hand. Do-hyun sat down by the fire and placed the axe on his lap. First, the blade. He removed it from the handle. The broken wedge fell out easily. The blade itself wasn't bad. If he removed the nicks and the overheated layer on the edge, he could create a new geometry, an asymmetrical one. The left bevel would be longer than the right, suited for his left dominant hand. He took out his stones and began to work, a coarse stone for rough shaping. The metal ground down slowly. He counted his passes and changed the angle every 20 strokes. After an hour, the nicks were gone. After an hour and a half, the edge was smooth. He switched to a fine stone. He brought it to working sharpness. Then the handle. He chopped down a young palm tree as thick as his wrist. He whittled it into the desired shape with a knife. Then he did something no carpenter here would ever do. He singed the blank in the coals. Not burned it, but specifically singed it, slowly turning it over the heat, watching the color of the wood. Light brown, dark brown, stop. He pulled the piece out of the fire and quickly cooled it in the stream. When charred, the resin inside the wood rises to the surface and seals the pores. The grain becomes denser, the axe handle becomes harder and doesn't rot from moisture. At a factory, he would have done this in a heat treatment oven at a controlled temperature. Here, he had a campfire and his eyes. His eyes didn't let him down. He fitted the blade onto the new axe handle. He changed the angle, 25 degrees instead of 20, for a left-handed grip. He wedged it in place with a wooden wedge and poured hot resin, which he had boiled down from the bark of the same tree, into the joint. The sun was sinking toward the horizon when he finished. Do-hyun weighed the axe in his hand. The balance had shifted closer to the blade. For a left-hander, that's right. The chopping stroke would follow an arc that ends exactly where it needs to, rather than drifting off to the side. He walked over to a log near his shelter and struck it. The blade sank a third of the way into the wood, clean, no vibration, no deviation. He pulled the axe out and looked at the cut. Smooth. He nodded. He wrapped the axe in a rag and headed toward the main camp. The bosun was sitting by the central fire, cleaning fish. Do-hyun approached and placed the axe in front of him. The bosun picked it up with one hand. He turned it over. He frowned. Then he stood up and walked over to the thick log that 4 men had tried to split that morning but couldn't. He took a swing. He struck. The blade sank in so easily that the bosun lurched forward, caught off guard. He struck again and again. The log split into 3 pieces. The bosun stood there, staring at the axe, then at Do-hyun. The camp fell silent. Everyone was watching. Do-hyun said the axe now suited his hand, that it would be awkward for anyone else to use. The bosun was silent for a long time. Then he nodded toward the cauldron. Do-hyun received his soup, watery and salty, with pieces of fish and some kind of roots. He ate slowly. He tried not to swallow too quickly so his stomach wouldn't cramp up. There were people around him, but no one spoke to him. They watched, some with interest, some with suspicion. A man with a bandaged hand approached and asked if he could fix his knife. The knife was dull and had a chipped tip. Do-hyun shook his head. He said, "Not here." His tools were at his campsite. He should come back tomorrow morning. The man nodded and left. Do-hyun finished eating and stood up. It was time to head back. The sun was already touching the water. He walked briskly along the beach. The shadows were growing longer. The jungle was beginning to quiet down. He had almost reached his little spot when he noticed someone sitting by his campfire. A small figure was crouching by the dying embers. He walked closer. It was a girl, young, Asian features. Her hair was tied back in a bun. Her clothes were just as torn and dirty as everyone else's, but cleaner. She looked up at him, not fearfully, not hostile. She just looked at him. Then she said she'd seen him working with the axe, that she'd been watching from behind the tents, that she wanted to stay here by his fire because she wasn't safe in the big camp. She didn't explain why. There was no need to explain. Do-hyun looked at her, then at the shelter, then at the fading sky. He said there wasn't enough room, that the shelter wasn't safe, that something from the jungle, and he doesn't know what it is. She replied that she knew, that she'd already seen them, that she hadn't slept for 4 nights because she was afraid to close her eyes. Do-hyun nodded. He stoked the fire. He tossed in some twigs. The fire grew. The girl sat down on the other side of the flames. She said her name was So Ha-un, that her father was a merchant, and they were sailing to Batavia when the ship was caught in a current. Her father died in the shipwreck. She survived. That was 10 days ago. On the 3rd day, a man with a bandaged arm arrived. His name was Grant. He was a sailor from one of the wrecked ships. His arm had been cut not by a knife, but by a claw. 3 long gashes ran from his shoulder to his elbow. The wound was inflamed, and the edges were already starting to turn black. Grant placed a knife in front of Do-hyun and said he would pay for the repairs. Do-hyun asked how. Grant pulled a piece of dried meat from behind his belt. Do-hyun took the knife. An ordinary sailor's knife with a wooden handle. The blade was made of soft steel. Something like that wouldn't hold an edge. 2 days of work at most, and it would be dull again. He examined it. His fingers slid habitually over the metal, and there it was again, that sensation. He could see the knife's history as if it were etched into the metal. It had been forged carelessly. The hardening was poor. The steel was soft, with a high phosphorus content. The grain was coarse. But the geometry of the bevels wasn't bad. If he reground it at a different angle and finished it properly, he could get the most out of this metal. Not a masterpiece, but a working tool. He said the knife would be ready by evening. Grant nodded and left. Ha-un sat by the fire and watched Do-hyun work. She didn't get in the way. She didn't ask any questions. She just sat and watched. Sometimes she tossed twigs into the fire. Sometimes she brought water from the stream. She did it so quietly and naturally that Do-hyun found a coconut shell cup filled with water next to him several times and couldn't remember when Ha-un had placed it there. By noon, he had finished Grant's knife and set to work on another project. He needed a weapon, a real one. Not a folding knife, but something he could use to face whatever came at night. He remembered the eyes, yellow and unblinking, at human height. That meant the creature was large. A knife was useless against something like that. He needed a spear. He cut down a bamboo stalk 3 fingers thick and 2.5 meters long. He whittled it down. He singed it over a fire like an axe handle, removing moisture and compacting the fibers. The tip was a problem. He had no metal except for his grandfather's knife, and he had no intention of touching it. He went down to the shore and wandered along the surf line for 2 hours. He found a piece of ship's iron, a fragment of a hatch hinge. It was rusty and rough, but beneath the crust of rust, the metal was still sound. He brought it back to the campfire and set to work. He heated it in the coals until it turned cherry red. He pulled it out with tongs made from 2 sticks. He placed it on a flat stone and began striking it with another stone, shaping it. It wasn't forging in the usual sense. Back at the factory, he would have laughed at such a process. But here and now, his hands knew what to do. He felt every blow. He felt the metal flow beneath the stone. He sensed the moment when he needed to stop and reheat it. He gauged the temperature by the color of the glow, light cherry red for forging, dark cherry red for normalizing, bright red for hardening. He worked until sunset. By evening, he had a blade tip, flat and triangular with 2 cutting edges, as long as his palm. Not pretty, it wasn't smooth, but it was sharp and sturdy. He hardened it in seawater. Salt water cools faster than fresh water and produces a tougher structure. Then he tempered it over coals. He heated it until it turned a light yellow color and let it cool in the air. This relieves internal stress and makes the steel less brittle. He fitted the tip onto the shaft and secured it with a strip of wet leather that Ha-un had found among the debris on the shore. The leather would dry and tighten securely. The spear was ready. Do-hyun weighed it in his hand. It was a bit heavy. The center of gravity was slightly forward. It wasn't suitable for throwing, but it was just right for a strike from a standing position. He jabbed it into a log. The tip sank in 2 fingers' depth. Good. Grant came for the knife before sunset. He took it,
ran his finger along the edge, raised his eyebrows, said the knife was like new, better than new. He left the meet and walked away. An hour after sunset, he returned, not alone. Another sailor was with him, a skinny, red-headed guy with freckles and a nervous look in his eyes. His name was Finn. Grant said that Finn wanted to sharpen his knife too, and that they wanted to stay the night by Do-hyun's campfire. Because last night at the big camp, the creature had dragged a man away, right out of his tent. No one heard a thing. In the morning, they found only blood on the sand and claw marks on the canvas. Do-hyun looked at his shelter, at its woven door, at the spear in his hand. Then he nodded. 4 by the fire is better than 2. It was a rough night. The creature came back. This time it didn't just stand in the darkness. It circled around. Do-hyun heard its footsteps, soft, heavy footsteps on the damp ground. It circled the campsite along the perimeter, once, twice, 3 times around. Then it stopped near the hut, and it struck. The woven wall cracked, bamboo stalks flew apart. Ha-eun screamed. Do-hyun jumped up and grabbed his spear. He saw it, in the light of the campfire. The creature was the size of a panther. Its black hide glistened, but it had no muzzle. Instead of a muzzle, there was a bony plate, white and smooth, with 2 slits for eyes from which a dim yellow light shone. The mouth was lower, beneath the plate. It was wide, with teeth that curved inward like hooks. Its paws ended not in claws, but in something halfway between claws and blades, long, curved, and gleaming in the firelight. The creature stood in the breach in the wall and stared at them. Do-hyun stepped forward and struck with his spear. The spearhead struck the bone plate. A screech, a spark. The spear slid off. The plate was harder than steel. The creature shook its head and knocked the spear aside. Then it leaped. Do-hyun fell onto his back. The creature flew over him. He rolled over, grabbed the spear, and struck again. This time he aimed lower, below the plate, at the throat. The spearhead sank into soft flesh, and the creature screeched. The sound was so piercing it made Do-hyun's ears ring. The creature jerked backward. The spear slipped from his hands. The creature retreated into the darkness, dragging the spear through its neck. Then came the sound of an impact. The creature collapsed. Silence. Do-hyun was on all fours, breathing heavily. His hands were shaking. Grant and Finn stood with knives in their hands, white as chalk. Ha-eun sat in the corner, her hands pressed to her chest. No one spoke. Do-hyun stood up. He picked up a burning branch from the campfire and walked into the darkness. Grant shouted for him not to go. Do-hyun didn't stop. The creature lay 5 steps from the shelter, dead. A spear stuck out of its throat. Black blood was seeping into the sand. Do-hyun crouched down beside it. He touched the bone plate. His fingers slid across the surface, and he sensed it. It wasn't bone, not entirely. The structure was layered, like a composite. The outer layer was hard and smooth. Beneath it was a porous layer that absorbed impact. Beneath that was another hard layer. 3 layers, like an armor plate. Nature, or something else, had created the perfect defense. His engineer's mind was already at work. If he removed this plate, if he dried it out, if he mounted it on a base, it would make a shield, or a breastplate, or a wall panel that no blade could pierce. He pulled the spear out of the creature's body. The tip was intact, slightly bent, but intact. Good tempering, good geometry. He nodded to himself. Then he began cutting the bone plate from the creature's snout. The work took half an hour. The knife cut through the connective tissue with difficulty, but managed it. The plate was heavy and warm to the touch. Do-hyun brought it to the campfire. He placed it on a rock.
Grant looked at it with horror, Finn with disgust. 5 days after the crash, there were 6 people gathered around Du Yun's campfire. Himself, Haun, Grant, Finn, a sailor named Park from a Korean merchant ship who had arrived silently and sat down by the fire without asking permission, and a girl. She appeared on the 4th day, red hair tied back in a ponytail, freckles on her sunburned nose, a pair of single-arm glasses that she held in place with a strip of vine. She approached Du Yun, who was sitting and whittling a second arrowhead from the creature's bone, and said her name was Emily Whately, that she was a botanist, that she'd seen him cut off the bone plate, and that she had 18 questions. Du Yun looked up. She didn't wait for an answer and began asking them. What is the structure of the plate? What kind of mineral is in the outer layer? Why doesn't the porous layer break when struck? How did he determine the direction of the fibers? Did he use an acid test? Does he have a hypothesis about the biological origin of the material? Do Hyun listened. Then he said he didn't have answers to half of those questions, but that the mineral was similar to hydroxyapatite, only denser, that the porous layer acted as a shock absorber, distributing the impact energy over the surface area, and that he hadn't done an acid test because he didn't have any acid, but if she could find a lemon tree, they could give it a try. Emily stared at him. Then she sat down next to him, pulled a crumpled notebook with a stub of a pencil from her bosom, and began to take notes. She didn't leave. Emily was the daughter of a naturalist. Her father had been sailing on an expedition sloop to catalog the plants of the southern islands. The sloop had been shipwrecked 3 months ago. Her father hadn't died in the crash, but later. The creature had taken him on the 2nd night. Emily had survived because her father had shoved her into an empty gunpowder barrel and closed the lid. She'd heard everything but seen nothing. After that, she'd attached herself to a large camp. The bosun put up with her because she knew which berries were edible and which weren't. But at the camp, they treated her like a piece of furniture. No one listened when she spoke. No one answered her questions. Until Hyun answered, and that settled everything. She stayed. The first thing she did was walk around the campsite and map out the edible plants. In a single day, she found 3 types of berries that were safe to eat, the roots of a plant similar to taro that could be boiled, leaves that could be brewed into a bitter but invigorating tea, and a tree with resin that, when heated, became viscous and sticky like glue. Do-hyun looked at a sample of the resin, and it clicked in his mind. Glue. Natural thermoplastic glue. Heat it, and it's soft. Cool it, and it's hard. If mixed with fibers, it would make a reinforced composite, like fiberglass, but made only from resin and palm fibers. He conducted an experiment. He cut thin strips of palm bark. He soaked them in hot resin. He laid them out in layers on a flat stone, alternating the direction of the fibers. He pressed down on top with another stone. In the morning, he removed it. The sheet was thin, light, and strong. He bent it. It flexed, but didn't break. He struck it with a knife. The knife left a scratch, but didn't pierce it. It wasn't armor, but it would do for wall paneling. Emily watched the process and recorded every step. She behaved like a scientist observing a rare species. Do-hyun was her subject of study, and he had no idea. Or perhaps he did, but didn't object. Meanwhile, the situation at the main camp was deteriorating. The creature had snatched 2 more people over the past week. One of the sailors had tried to head into the jungle at dawn to find another place. He never returned. The bosun kept order with and the threat of pistols, but the men were beginning to grumble. They could see that the small camp by the cliff was still standing, that Do-hyun had walls, however flimsy, that he had weapons that actually worked, that the creature had been bypassing his camp for the 2nd night in a row since he'd killed the first one. They didn't know that the creature wasn't bypassing the camp. It came every night. Do-hyun heard its footsteps, but it didn't attack. It stood in the darkness at the edge of the light and watched, as if studying, as if waiting. Do-hyun used every hour of daylight. He expanded the hut. He reinforced the walls with a double layer of bamboo reinforced with bone inserts. He made a roof out of palm leaves over a bamboo frame. He dug a shallow trench around the camp and filled it with shell fragments. Anyone who stepped on them would crunch. A simple signaling system. He made a second spear, shorter and lighter than the first, for Grant. The tip was made of ship's iron. Grant took it in his hands and looked at Do-hyun with an expression he had never seen before. It was neither fear nor gratitude. It was something akin to hope. On the 7th day, Ji-min arrived. She didn't come from the beach, but from above. Do-hyun heard a rustle, looked up, and saw a slender figure sitting on a tree branch right above his workshop, looking down. Short hair, a tanned face. She was dressed like a young boy, pants rolled up to her knees and a shirt 3 sizes too big. She sat on the branch as naturally as if she'd been born in a tree. Do-hyun asked how long she'd been there. She replied that she'd been there since morning, that she'd been watching him forge the spearhead, that she wanted one just like it. Do-hyun asked why she needed a spearhead. She jumped down from the branch, landing silently on the sand, and walked over to him. She was small. The top of her head barely reached his shoulder. She lifted her chin and said she was the best scout on the island, that she knew every tree within a mile, that she'd found 3 sources of fresh water and a cave in the rocks that no one else knew about, and that she needed a weapon because at night she went out without a light or a weapon, and that was foolish, even for her. Do-hyun looked at her. Then he asked her name. She blinked. On the ship, they called her Little One. At the bosun's camp, too. No one had ever asked her name. She was silent for a few seconds. Then she said quietly, almost in a whisper, "Ji-min." Do-hyun nodded. He said he'd make her a knife instead of a spearhead, a small, lightweight one that would fit her hand. She'd be able to carry it on her belt and draw it in a single motion. Ji-min stood there looking at him. Then she turned away abruptly and climbed back up the tree. A minute later, she was hidden from view among the foliage. On the 10th day, the bosun came himself. Do-hyun saw him from a distance, a broad figure in an unbuttoned shirt. Behind him were 2 sailors with knives on their belts. They walked along the beach without hurrying. The bosun stopped at the edge of the moat and looked around. He looked at the wall that had already closed off 2/3 of the perimeter, at the bamboo roof beams, at the stone platform by the campfire where the lumber and tools lay, at the moat filled with seashells, at the spears stuck in the sand at the entrance. Then he looked at Do-hyun, who was crouching and sharpening a new spearhead. The bosun said he was impressed. He said the engineer had set things up better than some people in his own camp. Then he said that 2 of his men wanted to transfer here, and that he'd come to tell Do-hyun not to accept them. Do-hyun looked up. He asked why. The bosun stepped across the ditch. Shells crunched under his boot. He came closer and spoke more quietly. He said the camp was in order, that 40 men stuck together because they were afraid, and that fear was the only thing keeping them from killing each other over the last piece of hardtack. If people started going over to the engineer with his knives and walls, that fear would disappear, and without fear, order would vanish too. Do-hyun remained silent. The bosun continued. He said he wasn't an enemy, that he understood Do-hyun was useful, but he needed to be useful there in the big camp, not here. He offered a deal. Do-hyun would move to the main camp. He'd get a tent, a spot by the fire, and double rations. In exchange, he'd repair weapons and do what he knew how to do for everyone. Do-hyun thought about it. Then he shook his head. He said he wouldn't go, that his workshop was here, his tools were here, his people were here. He wasn't going to poach anyone, but if anyone wanted to come, he wouldn't turn them away. The bosun clenched his jaw. The muscles in his neck bulged. One of the sailors behind him put his hand on his knife. Do-hyun stood up. In his right hand, he held a spearhead made from the bone of a creature, unfinished, unpolished. But even so, it looked more menacing than any knife on this island. Grant stepped out from behind the shelter with a spear. Finn stood against the wall. The bosun looked around. He assessed the situation. Then he relaxed his shoulders and stepped back. He said he'd remember this conversation. He turned and walked away. His sailors followed him. Haun stood behind the wall and listened to the entire conversation. When the bosun disappeared around the bend of the beach, she approached Do-hyun and whispered that he'd just made an enemy. Do-hyun replied that he was already an enemy. It was just that now it was clear to both of them. That night, everything changed. Do-hyun had grown accustomed to the solitary creature, to the soft footsteps along the perimeter, to the yellow eyes at the edge of the light. He'd grown accustomed to it and had almost stopped being afraid. That was a mistake. That night, 3 of them came. 3 pairs of yellow eyes flashed simultaneously from 3 directions. The branch in the ditch crackled all at once, 3 blows against the wall, simultaneously. The bamboo split in 2 places. Clay crumbled. Grant jumped up and grabbed his spear. Finn backed away toward the campfire. Park criticized in Korean and raised a sharpened stick, his only weapon. Haun grabbed a burning branch. Ji-min jumped down from the tree and landed inside the perimeter with a knife in her hand. Do-hyun stood with his spear in the center of the camp, listening. 3 creatures, 2 on the left, 1 on the right. The ones on the left were smaller, no bone plates on their snouts. Their fur was dark gray, not black. A different species. They moved faster and closer to the ground. The third one on the right was large, just like the one he'd killed, a bone plate, yellow eye slits. It stood there, waiting. The smaller ones attacked first. One broke through a weakened section of the wall and burst inside. Grant thrust his spear. He hit it in the side. The creature screeched and rolled back. A second one leaped over the wall from above and landed right by the campfire.
Ha-un hurled a burning branch at it. The creature recoiled. Do-hyun struck with his spear, hitting it in the shoulder. The spearhead went right through. The creature thrashed and fell. He pulled out the spear and turned to face the third one. The large creature slammed its entire body against the wall. The wall couldn't hold. The section collapsed. Bamboo and clay flew everywhere. The creature stepped over the debris and moved straight toward Do-hyun. Slowly, as if it weren't in a hurry. As if it knew he had nowhere to run. Do-hyun stepped back. He pressed his back against the remaining wall, spear held out in front of him. The creature stopped 2 steps away. Its eye slits glowed, its jaws opened. Hook-like teeth glinted in the light of the campfire. Ji-min leaped down on top of it from a branch. She landed on the creature's back and plunged her small knife into the base of its neck, where the bony plate met the body. The creature roared and thrashed its body. Ji-min clung to its hide with both feet and drove the knife deeper. The creature lunged to the side and slammed into a rock. Ji-min was thrown off and rolled across the sand. Do-hyun stepped forward and thrust his spear into the gaping wound on its neck, driving the tip in to its full length. The creature wheezed. It fell onto its front paws, then onto its side. It twitched twice and went still. The third small creature, which Grant had wounded, crawled into the breach in the wall and vanished into the darkness. Do-hyun stood there, panting. His hands were shaking so badly that he couldn't unclench his fingers around the spear shaft. He looked at Ji-min. She was sitting in the sand, clutching her side. He walked over and crouched down beside her. He asked if she was okay. She looked up at him. Her eyes were shining. She said she was fine, that she'd just bruised herself. Then she said the knife was good, that it went in easily. Do-hyun exhaled. He told her she was crazy. She didn't smile, but the corner of her mouth twitched. Do-hyun stood up and surveyed the camp. The wall had been breached in 2 places. One section was completely destroyed. Inside the perimeter lay 2 dead creatures. Black blood was seeping into the sand. Everyone was alive, not a single casualty. He looked at the dead creatures, 2 bodies, 2 bone plates, 4 sets of blade-like claws, hides, bones, tendons, material, lots of material. He realized one thing, and it was more important than anything else. The island hadn't tried to destroy them. If it had wanted to, it would have sent 10 creatures, not 3, or 20, or something that neither a wall nor a spear could protect them from. It sent exactly as many as they could handle, with losses, but they could handle them, as if it were testing them, as if it were ramping up the difficulty, like an exam whose purpose isn't to fail the student. The goal is for the student to learn. Du-Yun sat down by the fire. Haun silently placed a coconut cup of water next to him. He looked at her. She was pale and her hands were trembling, but she stood steady and her eyes were calm. He took the water and drank it. Then he said that tomorrow they would start butchering the carcasses, that the bones would be used for spearheads and for the wall, that the claws could be sharpened and used as blades, that the tendons, once dried, would be stronger than any rope, that the hide, if processed correctly, would withstand a blow. Haun nodded, and she quietly asked if she could have a knife too. Not a big one, a small one that would fit in her hand. Du-Yun looked at her hands, slender fingers, a narrow palm. He nodded. He said he'd make one. In the morning, he set to work. The creatures' carcasses hadn't decomposed overnight. The bodies were cold and stiff. He butchered them methodically, using a knife and a bone scraper he'd made from a shard of the first plate. He removed the hide in one piece and stretched it over stakes to dry. He cleaned and sorted the bones, the long tubular ones for shafts and handles, the flat ones for plates and tips, the small ones for hooks and fasteners. He removed the claws in their entirety, 12 from each creature. Each claw was as long as a finger and curved, hard, with a self-sharpening edge. He ran his finger along a claw and nearly cut himself. Nature had created the perfect blade. All that remained was to attach a handle. He soaked the tendons in seawater and stretched them into thin strands. Once dry, they became stiff and strong, better than any rope. By noon, he had enough material to last a month's work. He sat amid the spread-out bones and hides and made his plans. Claw tips for spearheads, plates made from skull shields for the wall, hides for covering the door and roof, bone hinges for the gate, tendons for bowstrings and bindings. He could arm all 6 of them. He could reinforce the wall so it would withstand an assault. He could build a door that wouldn't break. Haun came over and sat down beside him. She looked at the materials laid out before them. Then she said she needed to talk about their supplies, that the berries would last 3 days, that the roots were gone, that there was enough water but no food. 6 people meant 6 mouths to feed, and the jungle didn't provide food for free. They needed to hunt. They needed to fish. We need a system. Do-Hyun looked at her. She spoke calmly and precisely, like someone used to keeping track of things. A merchant's daughter. She knew how to keep records. That was exactly what he needed. He told her he'd put her in charge of everything related to supplies. Food, water, supplies. She'll distribute them. She'll keep track. She'll tell him when something's running low, and he'll figure out how to get it. Haun straightened up. Something had changed in her expression. She nodded, briefly, businesslike. Then she stood up and went to Emily to discuss where to find more edible plants. Do-Hyun watched her go. Then he went back to work. He needed to make her a knife. Not tomorrow. Today. He chose one of the claws from a large creature, parsing and straight with a slightly curved tip. Perfect. He made the handle from a smaller piece of bone, smoothing it on a stone until it was polished. He wrapped a strip of hide around it. He tested it himself. The claw held its edge perfectly. It cut through fabric like paper. Then he made something he was prouder of than any arrowhead. He made a folding knife. From 2 bone plates, he carved out the sides of the handle. Between them, he secured the claw blade on an axle made of thin bone, held in place by a tendon cord. The blade folded into the handle and opened with a single movement of the thumb. It locked in the open position with a small bone pin on a tendon spring. It wasn't a knife. It was a work of ingenuity, assembled from the bones of a monster on a deserted island. He adjusted the handle. He filed down the corners. He sanded the surface until it was smooth. He held it in his hand. It was a bit too big. He imagined Haun's hand, slender fingers and narrow palm. He filed off another millimeter from each side. He rounded the edge near the little finger. He tried it again. Now it fit her hand. That evening, when everyone sat around the campfire, he walked over to Haun and handed her the knife. She took it in her hands. She opened it, closed it, opened it again. The blade clicked into place. She looked at him. Do-hyun said the knife was hers, that it wasn't for lending,
Only for her. Haun looked at the knife, then at Do-hyun, then back at the knife. She gripped the handle, and he saw that it fit perfectly in her palm, as if it had been cast to her exact shape, because that was exactly what had happened. Haun turned away. Her shoulders trembled. She didn't make a sound, but Do-hyun saw her wipe her eyes with the back of her hand. Then she turned back around. Her eyes were red but dry. She said thank you, quietly and evenly, and she gripped the knife tighter. Emily watched from behind her notebook. Jimin sat on a branch and looked down. Grant and Finn exchanged glances. No one said anything. The campfire crackled. The jungle at night was silent. The creature didn't come that night. The first night without yellow eyes at the edge of the light. Do-hyun lay on his back and stared into the darkness. He thought about how the wall wasn't finished yet, that they needed a door, that everyone needed a weapon, that they needed food and the hunting system and signal fires and many other things. He thought about how he was an engineer, not a leader or a warrior. But for some reason these people had come to him, to his campfire, to his wall. And now he was responsible for them. Not because he wanted to, but because he did things right, and people saw that. On the 12th day, the wall was completed. The entire perimeter, 1 meter 20 high, double bamboo with clay fill and bone plates at key points. Not a fortress, but no longer just a hut. Do-hyun stood at the entrance, gazing at his creation. A moat lined with seashells ran along the entire outer wall. Inside the perimeter, the ground was clean and well-trodden, a fire pit in the center, a sleeping shelter on the right, a workshop on the left, a supply of firewood against the wall, a barrel made from a hollowed-out tree trunk for fresh water, 6 sleeping areas made of palm leaves on bamboo platforms so they wouldn't have to lie on the damp ground. The door was his pride and joy. The frame was made of thick bamboo. The door panels were made of 2 layers of animal hide. The hinges were made of bone plates mounted on tendons. The door opened inward and was secured with a bolt carved from a single piece of bone from the thigh of a large animal. He tested it. He rammed the door with his shoulder from a running start. The door didn't budge. The bolt held. The hinges didn't creak. Good. Now he had to solve the problem of food. Haun counted their supplies every morning, and every morning her face grew a little more tense. The berries were running out. The roots from the nearby thickets had been dug up. He had nothing to catch fish with. Do-hyun sat by the fire and thought. He needed hooks, he needed fishing line, he needed traps for small game. He made the hooks from the claws of small creatures. He shaped them on a stone to the right form. He bent the tip. He sharpened the barbs so the fish wouldn't get away. He braided the fishing line from tendons, thin but strong. Each strand could hold a weight of several kilograms. Braided 4 strands together, they could hold a large fish. He carved the fishing rod from young bamboo, flexible and long. Finn turned out to be a fisherman. He grew up on the coast of Ireland and had been fishing before he could walk. He took the rod in his hands and looked at Do-hyun with the same expression Grant had when he received the spear. Then he walked down to the water. 2 hours later, he returned with 4 fish, each as long as an elbow, silvery with blue stripes. Finn said he'd never seen any like them before, that they were biting like crazy, that there were so many fish in these waters they could feed an army. Haun took the fish and began to clean them. She did it skillfully. As the merchant's daughter, she had seen many fish markets. Do-hyun made her a cutting board out of a flat bone and a second knife, a utility knife, not a folding one, but with a fixed blade made from a claw. Wide and thin, it was suitable for both fish and meat. Haun took it and ran it along the fish's scales. The scales came off in one smooth motion. She nodded. A good knife. That evening they ate grilled fish. For the first time in 12 days, everyone ate their fill. Grant said it was the best meal of his life. Finn laughed and said Grant just hadn't eaten proper Irish fish yet. Park silently finished his portion and asked for seconds. Emily was jotting down the type of fish in her notebook and trying to identify the family. Jimin sat on a branch and gnawed on the tail. Haun ate slowly and neatly. She was the only one who ate as if she were sitting at a table rather than on the ground in the middle of the jungle. Do-hyun watched them and felt that something strange, not joy, not relief, something simpler. People with full bellies by his campfire, a wall that stood, a door that closed. That was enough.
On the 13th day, 3 more people from the large camp came to the wall, 2 women and a man. The women's names were Martha and Liz. The man's name was Henrik. They stood by the moat and looked over the wall. Martha said that last night at the bosun's camp, the creature had killed another person. That this was already the 7th in 2 weeks, that the bosun had forbidden anyone from leaving the camp after sunset, but it didn't help because the creatures were coming into the camp themselves. She said they wanted to stay here, that they'd work, anything. Do-hyun looked at Haun. She was standing nearby, counting in her head. Then she said quietly that there would be enough food if Finn went fishing twice a day, but there wasn't enough space. They needed to expand the perimeter. Do-hyun nodded. He let them in. 9 people. The perimeter had to be expanded. He marked out a new line for the wall, further from the center and wider. It would take a week's work if everyone pitched in. Martha turned out to be a seamstress. She knew how to work with fabric and leather. Do-hyun gave her animal hides and bone needles he'd carved from small bones, tendon threads instead of sewing thread. Martha looked at the needles and said they were better than the ones she'd had at home in Bristol. Do-hyun didn't mention that they were monster bones. It didn't matter what they were made of. What mattered was that they worked. Liz was a farmer's wife and knew how to work the land. She looked at the plot inside the new perimeter and said they could lay out garden beds here. The soil was rich, there was plenty of water. If they could find seeds for something edible, they'd have their own vegetable garden in a month. Emily jumped for joy. She knew where wild beans grew and wild yams, and something that looked like a pumpkin. She dragged Liz into the jungle to show her. Henrik was a carpenter, a quiet, tall Swede who spoke little and worked hard. Hyun handed him an axe and showed him how he wanted the posts for the new wall to be set. Henrik nodded and got to work. No questions asked, no arguments. He just worked. By evening on the 14th day, the new wall line had been marked out and the first posts driven into the ground. The camp area had tripled in size. Do-hyun stood in the center and made plans. The workshop here, the sleeping shelter there, the kitchen by the stream, the materials storage by the rock, the garden beds in the far corner where there's more sun. He drew the plan with a stick in the sand. Haun stood beside him, memorizing it. She didn't take notes, she memorized everything. Every number, every measurement, every name. Do-hyun was beginning to realize that without her, he would have already drowned in chaos. She was his memory and his order. On the 15th day, what he had been waiting for and fearing happened. A girl emerged from the jungle. Alone, unarmed, barefoot, in tattered clothes that had once been a Korean hanbok, but were now nothing more than rags tied together with vines. Her hair was long and tangled, reaching down to her waist. Her skin was dark from sun and dirt. She moved silently, like a beast. Grant spotted her first and raised his spear. She stopped, looked at him, then at the wall, then at Do-hyun, who had stepped out from behind the canopy with a spearhead in his hand.
She looked at him for a long time. Then she said one word in Korean. "Master." Do-hyun froze. She knew that word. She knew Korean. She looked at his hands, at the soot, at the calluses, at the bone tip. She saw what he was doing and understood before he had a chance to introduce himself. He asked who she was. She remained silent. He asked how long she'd been there. She raised her hand and held up 2 fingers. Then she traced the horizon with her hand. 2 solar cycles, 2 years. She had lived alone on this island for 2 years. Do-hyun lowered the spearhead. He asked her name. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again, as if she'd forgotten how to speak. Then she said quietly and hoarsely, "Yuna." Just Yuna. Do-hyun nodded. He told her to come in. Haeun brought her water and fish. Yuna ate with her hands, quickly and greedily. Then she drank. Then she sat there staring at the fire. She didn't speak, but she didn't leave either. Emily sat down next to her and started asking questions. Yuna looked at her in such a way that Emily fell silent mid-sentence. The look wasn't angry, just empty, like that of someone who had forgotten what conversation was. That night, Yuna didn't stay inside the wall. She went into the jungle. Do-hyun saw her leap over the wall in a single motion and disappear into the darkness, without a sound. He didn't try to stop her. In the morning, she was sitting outside by the entrance. A dead monkey lay next to her, a large one with hands that ended in bony hooks. A beast. Yuna killed it with her bare hands, or almost bare. In her right hand, she held a sharpened stone, just a stone with a sharp edge. She'd survived on that for 2 years.
Do-hyun crouched down next to the carcass. He looked at the monkey. The hook-like hands were made of the same material as a panther's claws, a bone composite. Self-sharpening. He touched the hook and his fingers sensed the material. Denser than a panther's, a different structure. More mineral, less porous layer, harder but more brittle. It wouldn't work for striking tools, but it was ideal for cutting tools. He looked at Yuna. She was watching his hands, how he touched the material, how his fingers moved. She saw. She understood. She'd lived here for 2 years and knew these creatures better than anyone. She knew where they lived, how they hunted, what they feared. She knew the paths they took at night and the places where they slept during the day. She was the key to the island. And she had come to him. Do-hyun pulled a bone comb from his belt. He'd made it last night from the rib of a small creature. The thin teeth had been smoothed to a fine polish on a stone, even, all the same length. Nothing meant for fighting, just a comb. He placed it on the sand next to Yuna, not in her hands, just next to her, and he walked away. The next morning, Yuna sat by the fire with her hair down. She combed it with slow, deliberate strokes. The comb glided through her strands, and Yuna gazed at the fire. Haeun stood off to the side and watched. Then she approached Do-hyun and quietly said that he was a dangerous man. Do-hyun didn't understand and asked why. Haeun shook her head and said it didn't matter, but she was smiling as she said it. Yuna spoke on the 3rd day after her arrival, not on her own. Do-hyun prompted her. He was butchering the carcass of a monkey-like creature and noticed that Yuna was standing nearby, watching. He picked up one of the hooks and asked if she knew where these creatures came from at night. Yuna was silent for about 10 seconds. Then she pointed deep into the island, toward the south, toward the mountain that loomed over the jungle as a dark mass. She said one word. Nests. Do-hyun asked how many there were. Yuna raised both hands and spread her fingers wide, then again and again. Many, very many. But not all of them come out at night. At night, only those whom the island sends out come out. She said it so casually, as if she were talking about the weather. The island sends them out. Do-hyun remembered those words. Then he asked if she could show him the trails. Yuna looked at him, a long, steady gaze.
Then she nodded.
They set out after dawn. Yuna led the way. Do-hyun followed behind her with a spear slung over his shoulder. Ha-eun wanted to go with them, but Do-hyun shook his head. Someone had to stay behind and watch over the camp. Ha-eun didn't argue. She nodded and stood at the gate, watching them go. Yuna moved through the jungle like water over rocks, effortlessly, silently. Effortlessly. She didn't push the branches aside, but passed right through them. She didn't step over the roots, but walked on them as if they were steps. Do-hyun trudged along behind her like a bear through the underbrush. Every step he took could be heard 10 meters away. Yuna would stop and wait for him with an expression of infinite patience on her face. An hour later, they came to a place that Yuna called a trail. Do-hyun wouldn't have it on his own under any circumstances. A narrow strip of trampled earth, no wider than a palm, barely noticeable scratches on the tree roots. The smell. A sharp, sour smell that Do-hyun already recognized. That's how dead animals smelled. Yuna crouched down and pointed to the tracks. The claws had left 3 parallel furrows, deep, fresh. They'd walked this trail last night. Do-hyun crouched down beside her and looked. The trail ran from south to north, from the mountain to the coast, to their coast. Yuna said there were 6 trails, all led from the mountain to different sections of the shore. The creatures didn't wander aimlessly. They had set routes, like patrols. Do-hyun thought, if you know the routes, you can set traps. Not on the cliff face, but along the approach. Intercept them before they reach the camp. He asked Yuna if she could show him the other 5 trails. Yuna nodded. They walked until noon. 6 trails, all radiated out from the mountain like rays. Between the trails, the jungle was untouched. The creatures didn't stray from the routes, as if something were guiding them, or as if they themselves were part of the system. Do-hyun memorized every turn, every landmark. A tree with red bark, a rock shaped like a head, the stream that crossed the 3rd trail. He was mapping it out in his head. On the way back, Yuna stopped. She turned to him and said the longest sentence he'd ever heard from her. She said there used to be fewer creatures. When she first arrived on the island 2 years ago, they'd come once every 3 nights. 1 creature, a small one. Then more often, then more of them, then bigger ones. The island was responding to her,
To the fact that she was surviving. Every time she killed a creature, the next one was stronger, as if the island were testing her limits. Then she stopped killing. She stopped building. She stopped making tools. She just hid. And the creatures stopped coming to her. They passed her by. They didn't notice her. She became invisible. But when Do-hyun showed up and started building, forging, and killing, everything came back. The island awoke again. Do-hyun stood there and listened. Then he asked what she thought the island wanted. Yuna looked at the mountain, then at him. She said she didn't know, but that there was something up there on the mountain. She'd seen a light at night, just once. A faint blue light at the summit. She hadn't gone up there. She was afraid. Do-hyun remembered that, too. They returned to camp by evening. Ha-eun met them at the gate. She said a man had come from the bosun. He brought a proposal. The bosun was ready to trade, fish and meat in exchange for sharpening weapons. Do-hyun sat by the fire and thought. Trading meant acknowledgement. The bosun could no longer pretend that the small camp didn't exist. 10 people, a wall, a workshop. This was already a force to be reckoned with. He agreed. The terms were simple. Every knife or axe brought from the large camp would be sharpened and repaired by Do-hyun. In return, the large camp would share its hunting spoils. Half a wild boar for 5 knives, a bundle of fish for an axe. Ha-eun wrote the terms on a piece of bark with charcoal, the first contract on the island. Trade began the next day. A sailor from the main camp brought 3 knives. They were all in terrible condition, dull, rusty, with rickety handles.
Du Hyun worked for half a day. He took each knife in his hands and examined it. This one belongs to a right-hander with a strong grip. The sharpening angle is 20 degrees. This one is for a left-hander. This one is for someone who cuts away from themselves rather than toward themselves. He sharpened each one to suit its owner, even though he hadn't seen the owners. He simply read the wear patterns to determine how a person held the knife and what they used it for. The sailor took the knives and left. In the evening, he returned with half a pig carcass. Meat. Real meat. Haun took the carcass and began to butcher it. She worked with the new knife that Du Hyun had made for her. The blade, made from a claw, sliced through the meat and tendons effortlessly.
She butchered half the pig in 2 10-minutes. It used to take an hour. A good tool saves time. Time is life. Du Hyun began working on traps. The idea was simple. If the creatures follow fixed paths, then barriers can be set up. Not walls. You can't build a wall in the jungle. But you can dig pits, and you can place stakes at the bottom. And you can set up spears on tension lines made of tendons. He started with the third trail, the one closest to the camp. Yuna pointed out a spot where the trail narrowed between 2 large trees. Du Hyun dug a pit waist deep and 2 steps wide. He drove 6 stakes made of charred bamboo into the bottom, each tipped with the creature's claws. He covered the pit with a lattice of thin twigs and filled it with leaves. Nearby, he set up 2 tripwires, thin tendril cords stretched across the grave at ankle height. The thread was attached to a bent bamboo stalk, at the end of which a bone tip was tied. The creature snags the thread, the bamboo straightens, the tip strikes toward the trail. Simple mechanics. At the factory, he would have called it a primitive, single-use, automated process. Here, it was a trap that could kill. He set 3 traps in 2 days, unethical 3 nearest trails. Yuna helped, silently. She carried the stakes and showed him where to place them. By the end of the 3rd week, 14 people were living in the small camp. The wall had grown to 2 meters high, double-layered, filled with clay and reinforced with bone plates every half meter. The gate was reinforced with a frame made of 4 bamboo trunks bound together with tendons and covered with double hide. The bolt locked from the inside, and it was impossible to pull it out from the outside. The workshop had expanded. Now it was a shed on 6 posts with a stone floor that Henrik had laid out using flat stones he'd pulled from the stream. In the center stood an anvil, not a real one, a piece of basalt the size of 2 fists with a flat upper surface. Next to it were 3 hammers. Each was made of a stone of a different size attached to a wooden handle. Beside them were bellows. Hyun had made them from a bamboo frame and the hide of a creature. 2 plates covered with leather, with a valve made from the creature's intestine acting as a check valve. When compressed, air flowed in one direction. When released, the valve closed and air was drawn in from the other side. A simple design.
But it allowed the fire to be fanned up to a temperature at which steel became malleable. And the pit furnace, a pit knee-deep, lined with stones. Coal was loaded into it. The meha forced air through a bamboo tube. The temperature rose to the point where the iron began to glow. This was enough for reforging, but not for smelting. Before this, Hyun couldn't extract new metal from ore, but he could transform any piece of old metal into something better. He started with ship nails. Jimin found a scattering of debris at the southern end of the beach. Another ship had once wrecked there, an old one. The planks had rotted away, but the iron remained. Nails, staples, hinges, pieces of plating. She dragged a sack stuffed with rusty iron and dumped it in front of the workshop with the air of a hunter bringing back his catch. Du Hyun sorted through every piece. He picked them up, he examined them. This nail is made of good forged iron with a low carbon content. It's soft. It's no good for a knife, but it's just right for hooks and fasteners. This bracket is made of cast iron, brittle. If I reforge it with decarburization, I can get decent steel. This piece of sheet metal is thin, for small parts. He worked for 3 days straight. Ha-un brought him food and water. He ate without looking up. He drank without stopping.
His hands moved of their own accord. Heat, strike, turn, strike, check, back into the fire. From the pile of rusty iron, he pulled out 12 knives, each one different, each one for a specific person. For Grant, a wide, heavy knife with a thick heel, for cutting meat and chopping. For Finn, a thin, long knife with a flexible blade, for gutting fish. For Pock, a medium-sized, all-purpose knife, for work and for self-defense. For Henrik, a broad-bladed cleaver, for working with wood. For Martha, a small with a short blade and a comfortable handle, for cutting leather and fabric. For Liz, a garden knife with a rounded tip and a serrated edge, for working with roots and stems. For the rest, according to their hands and their work. He handed out the knives on the morning of the 4th day. People approached one by one. They took them in their hands. They tried them out. Each knife fit into its owner's hand as if it were a part of their body, because it was. Do-hyun watched as they worked with their new knives. Grant butchered a pig in 15 minutes instead of an hour. Finn filleted a fish in a single motion.
Martha cut open the animal's hide in a straight line without a single ragged edge. People worked faster, more precisely, with greater confidence. A good tool doesn't just make work easier, it changes a person. A person with the right knife moves differently, stands differently, looks differently. He knows that in his hand is something that won't let him down, and that knowledge makes him stronger. Haun kept track of things. She had a book, not a real book, a stack of bark pieces bound together with sinew thread. She wrote in charcoal, in small, neat handwriting, food supplies, material usage, a list of tools, and who had been issued what, duty roster, hunting and fishing schedule. When Do-hyun saw her book, he stopped and stared at it for a long time. Then he said that if she were at a factory, she'd be the best supply manager. Haun didn't understand the word manager, but she understood the tone. She smiled slightly and closed the notebook. Meanwhile, Emily made a discovery. She was examining the body of a small creature that Do-hyun had brought back from the trail. She cut open the chest cavity. She found a heart, an ordinary heart, 4-chambered, like a mammal's. She found lungs, ordinary lungs. She found a stomach with remnants of meat and bones. These creatures ate. They breathed. They had blood circulation. They were alive in the full biological sense, not demons, not spirits, animals. But with bone armor unlike anything she knew from zoology. She showed Do-hyun a cross-section of the bone plate, under the magnifying glass he'd made for her from a polished piece of rock crystal found by the stream. 3 layers, just as he'd determined earlier. The outer layer was dense, the middle layer was porous, the inner layer was dense. Emily said that the outer layer resembled tooth enamel in structure, the middle layer was similar to spongy bone. The inner layer was like dentin, a tooth. The entire plate was structured like a giant tooth. Nature had taken the strongest biological material and turned it into armor. Do-hyun listened, his engineering mind racing. If it's enamel, then it contains hydroxyapatite. If it's hydroxyapatite, then when heated above 800 degrees, it turns into tricalcium phosphate. Brittle. But if heated to 600 and cooled slowly, the structure densifies. It becomes even harder. Heat treatment of bone. It sounds crazy, but he gave it a try. He took a small fragment of a bone plate, placed it in a pit furnace. Blowed the bellows, watched the color. Bone doesn't glow like metal, but it changes hue. White, yellow, brown. Stop. He pulled the fragment out with tongs and let it cool in the air, slowly, without water. When the bone had cooled, he tested it. He ran the creature's claw across the surface. Before, the claw had left a light scratch. Now it left nothing. The bone had become harder, noticeably harder. Emily watched this with her mouth agape. Then she grabbed her notebook and began scribbling. Do-hyun looked at the fragment in his hands. Heat-treated bone from the creature, stronger than steel, lighter than iron, can be shaped on a whetstone.
You can make more than just arrowheads out of this. You can make armor out of this." On the 21st day, Annabeth arrived. She didn't come on her own, she was brought in. Grant and Finn found her on the beach between the two camps. She was sitting on the sand, bandaging the arm of a man from the larger camp. His arm was torn open from the elbow to the wrist. The creature had attacked him the night before. Annabeth was stitching the wound with a needle made of fishbone and thread from unraveled fabric. Her hands were covered in blood up to her elbows, but they didn't tremble. She worked calmly and precisely. The man was grinding his teeth, but didn't scream. When she finished, Grant walked over and said that their engineer made good tools. Maybe she could use some proper surgical needles. Annabeth looked up. She looked at Grant, then at Finn. Then she stood up and followed them. She entered the camp and stopped at the gate. She looked around at the wall, the workshop, the people, and the campfire. Then she looked at Do-hyun, who was sitting at the anvil, forging yet another knife. She walked over and said she needed needles, surgical ones, with an eye for thread, made of metal that doesn't rust in blood, and clamps, and a scalpel, and tweezers. And if he's really as good as they say, a lancet for lancing abscesses. Do-hyun looked at her hands, long fingers, confident movements, the hands of a surgeon. He asked where she was from. She said she was from Boston, that she was a nurse with the American mission, that the mission had sunk along with all her instruments 2 months ago. Since then, she'd been treating people with fish bones and rags, that 4 people had died because she didn't have anything to suture the wounds properly. Her voice was steady, but when she said 4, something flashed in her eyes. Do-hyun nodded. He said she'd have a kit by tomorrow morning.
Annabeth looked at him as if he'd said he'd build a palace by morning, with polite skepticism. Then she shrugged and went to Haun to discuss a location. Do-hyun worked all night. Needles. He took ship nails made of soft, wrought iron. He reforged each one into a thin rod, as sharpened them. He made an eye by heating the tip red-hot and piercing it with a thin bone pin. He polished them on a fine stone until they were mirror-smooth, 5 needles of different sizes, curved, like surgical needles. He knew the shape because the factory had made medical instruments for a client, and he'd seen the blueprints. Clamps, 2 pieces of spring steel from a ship's latch. He reforged them into flat plates with serrated jaws at the end. He connected them with a bone pin as an axle. The clamp opened and closed with one hand. The jaws closed evenly. A scalpel, a thin blade made from the finest piece of steel he had. He sharpened it for 2 hours. The edge was so sharp it could cut through a hair. The handle was made of charred bamboo wrapped in a strip of animal hide. The hide was rough. It didn't slip even in wet hands. Tweezers, 2 thin, springy prongs made from a ship's spring, tapered to a point at the end. A lancet, a short, wide blade on a long, thin handle, for precise incisions deep within a wound. He placed everything in the case. He made the case from 2 bone plates fastened together with leather loops. Inside, he carved grooves for each instrument. Every needle, every forceps, every blade lay in its place. Nothing rattled, nothing scratched its neighbors. He sat and looked at the finished set. Then he took the creature's claw and carved letters on the inside of the lid. Annabeth Cross. In the morning, he handed her the set. Annabeth opened the case. She took a needle. She twirled it between her fingers. She squeezed the clamp, opened it, squeezed it again. The serrated jaws snapped shut with a soft click, smoothly, no wobble. She picked up the scalpel, ran her thumb along the handle. The skin didn't slip. She turned the blade toward the light. The edge gleamed like a mirror. Then she saw the inscription on the lid, her name. She stared at it for a long time. Then she closed the case. She set it on her lap. She turned away toward the wall and remained silent for a long time. When she turned back, her eyes were dry but red. She said thank you. Her voice was hoarse.
Du-hyun nodded. He said nothing else. Annabeth pressed the case to her chest and went to her corner. From that day on, she never left. A month on the island, 30 days. Du-hyun kept track with notches on a post by the workshop, 30 short lines and one long one across every 5. The camp had become a fortress. A 2-meter wall enclosed the entire perimeter, a gate with a double bolt, 4 observation posts at the corners, wooden platforms at the height of the wall from which one could see the approaches and throw spears. The moat was widened and deepened. At the bottom were stakes made of charred bamboo with bone tips. Inside were 21 people. More than half came from the bosun's large camp. The bosun had 17 left. The balance of power was shifting, and the bosun could sense it. He had stopped sending people to trade. Instead, he sent a single man with a message. The message was simple. Trade is over. Du-hyun must return the people who left. If he does not, the bosun will come and take them himself. Ha-yoon read the message aloud by the campfire. Everyone heard it. Grant spat and said the bosun could try. Finn nervously rubbed his neck. Henrik silently checked his axe. Annabeth said that if it came to a fight, she wouldn't stitch up both sides, only her own. Jimin jumped down from the tree and asked if she should go to their camp to see what was going on. Du-hyun shook his head. He said it wasn't necessary, that the bosun wouldn't attack, not now. He had 2 pistols and 6 rounds. That was his only trump card. He wouldn't waste his ammunition as long as there was a creature that could show up any night. He'd wait. He'd try to wear them down with a blockade. He'd cut off access to the southern beach where the metal debris lay. He'd block the trail to the distant stream. It made sense. It was what any commander with 2 trump cards and a dwindling army would do. Ha-yoon looked at him. She asked how he knew how commanders thought. Du-hyun replied that he didn't know, but he knew how people thought when their resources were running out. At the factory, he'd seen it every quarter. Du-hyun began to prepare, not for battle, for a siege. If the bosun cut off access to the southern beach, they would need another source of iron. He sent Jimin on a reconnaissance mission along the coast to the east. She left at dawn and returned around noon. She found another spot with wreckage, an old one, a very old one. The wood had completely rotted away, but the metal parts lay in the sand. An anchor chain, 6 meters of heavy links covered in a crust of rust, but still intact inside. An iron cauldron with a punctured bottom. The remains of a cannon, bronze. Du-hyun heard the word bronze and stood up. Bronze, copper and tin, an alloy that doesn't rust, that melts at a lower temperature than iron, that can be cast into molds. Du-hyun, Jimin, Grant, and Park went to the crash site. The cannon was half buried in sand. They dug it out in an hour. The barrel was split open, but there were 30 kilograms of metal. Du-hyun touched the bronze. His hands identified the alloy instantly. 90% copper, about 8%, 2% lead. Cannon bronze. Durable. Cast. Melting point around 950 degrees. His pit furnace with bellows reached a maximum of 800. He was short by 150 degrees, he thought. Then he looked at Emily. He asked if there were any trees on the island with very dense wood, the kind that burns hotter than usual. Emily thought for a moment and said she'd seen a tree resembling an ironwood deep in the jungle. The wood was so dense that it sank into water. Do-hyun asked her to show him. They found the tree. He chopped off a branch. It was heavy and dense. He split it open and put it in the fire. The branch took a while to catch fire, but once it did, the heat was so intense that it was impossible to get closer than 2 steps. The charcoal from this wood burned 3 times hotter than usual. Do-hyun redesigned the furnace. He deepened the pit. He lined the walls with 2 layers of stone. He made a second pair of bellows. Now 2 people were pumping air at the same time. He loaded the ironwood charcoal into the furnace. He stoked the fire. The temperature began to rise. The stones around the pit began to crack from the heat.
He placed the first piece of bronze into the stone crucible. He waited. 5 minutes. 10. The bronze began to change color. It darkened. Then it glowed a dark red, then brighter. Then the surface began to tremble, and it began to flow. The bronze had melted. Do-hyun stared at the molten metal in the stone crucible and felt something shift inside him. This was more than just sharpening knives, more than just reforging nails. He could melt metal. He could pour it into molds. He could create things that had never existed on this island. He carved a mold out of clay, a simple knife.
He poured in the bronze. He waited. He removed it. The casting was rough, with burrs and cavities, but the shape was correct. He smoothed it on a stone. He sharpened it. The bronze knife glinted gold in the light of the campfire. Not as hard as steel, not as sharp, but bronze doesn't rust. Bronze isn't afraid of water or salt. On an island where everything is covered in moisture and salt, that was more important than hardness. Emily watched the smelting process with such an expression on her face that Ji-min later said it was as if she had seen God. Emily replied that it wasn't God, but a man who had just transitioned from the Stone Age to the Bronze Age in a single day. She was right. Do-hyun laughed. For the first time on the island. A short, quiet laugh. Ha-eun turned her head. She had never heard him laugh before. Do-hyun began casting. He worked for 3 days. A bronze axe for Henrik, a heavy cast piece with a lug for the handle, a set of hooks for Finn, bronze ones, durable ones, buckles for belts, hinges for the new gate, spears. The bronze spearheads were softer than bone, but they could be cast by the dozen in a single mold. Mass production. He spoke these words aloud and shuddered at them himself. At the factory, it was routine. Here, it was a revolution. The bosun found out. Someone who traveled between the camps had told him. On the 28th day, the bosun himself came to the fortress wall, alone, without sailors, without weapons in his hands. His pistols hung at his belt, but the holsters were fastened. He stood at the gate and waited. Do-hyun came out. They stood on opposite sides of the moat and looked at each other. The bosun said he'd heard about the bronze, that he was impressed, that the engineer had golden hands, and not just figuratively. Then he said he hadn't come to argue, that there were 3 wounded men in his camp after the night attack, that 5 of those creatures had come, that they'd dragged off 1 sailor and torn 2 others to pieces, that he'd heard there was a doctor in the fortress with real medical instruments. He was asking for help. Do-hyun looked at him. Then he turned to Annabeth. She was standing by the awning with a case in her hand. She had already heard the news. She walked out through the gate, past the bosun without looking at him, and headed toward the large camp. The bosun watched her go. Then he looked at Do-hyun. He said he was taking back what he'd said, that trade would resume, that he wouldn't block off the southern beach, that the 2 camps could coexist. Do-hyun nodded. The bosun turned and walked after Annabeth. Do-hyun stood there, watching him go. Ha-eun approached and stood beside him. She said quietly that he hadn't backed down because he'd become kinder. He'd backed down because he'd become weaker. His camp was falling apart. People were leaving. The beasts were multiplying. Soon he'd come not to trade, but to beg to be let in. Do-hyun replied that when he came, they would accept him. Ha-eun looked at him. Then she shook her head and said he was too kind for this place. Do-hyun replied that he wasn't kind. It's just that 21 people behind the wall isn't enough. He needs 40. On the 35th day, the island responded. Do-hyun had been expecting this. Yuna had warned him. Every time he created something new, the island raised the stakes. The knife brought a single creature, the spear brought 3. Bronze brought an army. They arrived after midnight. Ji-min was the first to see them. She was on watch at the eastern platform and let out a short whistle signaling danger. Do-hyun woke up instantly. He grabbed his spear and climbed onto the wall. He looked into the darkness.
and he saw them. Eyes. Dozens of pairs of yellow eyes. They were emerging from the jungle simultaneously across the entire front. Panthers with bony muzzles. Small gray creatures moving in a pack. And something new. Big. Very big. It was walking behind the rest, and the ground shook beneath its footsteps. Do-hyun climbed down from the wall. He woke everyone up. 21 people took their positions to defend. Everyone knew their place. They'd been rehearsing this for 3 days straight after Haun drew up the plan. 4 on the walls with spears, 6 at the gates, 2 on each platform. Annabeth in cover with her tools at the ready. Haun by the signal fire in the center of the camp. Emily next to her with spare spears and torches. Yuna had disappeared. She'd gone behind the wall into the darkness. Emily was beside her with spare spears and torches. Yuna had vanished. She'd gone beyond the wall into the darkness. Do-hyun didn't try to stop her. She knew what she was doing. The first wave struck a minute later. Small gray creatures, 6 of them. They charged the wall simultaneously from 3 sides. 4 got stuck in the moat. The stakes at the bottom pierced 2 of them. 2 made it across the moat and leaped onto the wall. Grant stabbed one in the throat with his spear. It fell back into the moat. Park took down the second one by striking it in the side with a sharpened pole.
The creature hung from the wall, twitching and wheezing. Park struck it again and it fell. The 2 remaining small ones circled around the wall and charged the gate. The bamboo creaked. The hide covering the gate panels stretched taut. The bolt held. The 6 at the gate thrust their spears through the slits in the panels. 1 hit its mark. The creature screeched and retreated. The second one struck again. The left hinge of the gate creaked. Do-hyun saw this and rushed to the gate. He braced his shoulder against the gate panel. Henrik stood beside him. The creature thrashed from the outside. Every blow reverberated through his ribs. Then Finn thrust his spear through the top of the gate and struck down from above. He hit it in the nape of the neck. The creature collapsed. Silence. 1 second, 2, 3. Then the panthers came. 3 of them, large, with bony plates on their muzzles. They didn't charge the wall. They circled around it, slowly, looking for a weak spot. They found it, a section of the wall that Do-hyun had been rebuilding 2 days ago. The clay hadn't completely dried yet. The first panther slammed into that section with its full weight. The wall cracked, clay crumbled. A second blow and the bamboo split apart. A third and a 1-meter-wide breach opened in the wall. The panther burst through. Marta screamed. Liz retreated toward the campfire. Grant spun around and threw his spear. It struck the panther in the side. The spear lodged between its ribs. The panther shook its body and snapped the shaft. The tip remained inside. The beast advanced with the spear fragment lodged in its side. Blood was flowing, but it didn't stop. A second panther entered through the same breach. A third followed. 3 beasts inside the walls. Do-hyun threw his spear. It bounced off the first panther's bony plate. Useless. A head-on attack wasn't working. He remembered. Under the plate, into the throat. He grabbed a second spear and waited. The first panther leaped at Grant. Grant fell. The creature pinned him down. Park struck it from the side. The spearhead slid across the hide without piercing it. The hide was tougher than that of the ones that had come before. These were stronger. The island was ramping up the difficulty. Do-hyun ran up and struck beneath the plate from below. The tip pierced the soft tissue of its throat. The creature twitched. It wheezed. It fell onto its side, pinning Grant beneath it.
He crawled out from under it, pale with terror but unharmed. The second panther lunged toward the shelter where Annabeth was hiding. Annabeth didn't run. She stood with a scalpel in one hand and a burning branch in the other. When the creature leaped, she shoved the torch into its face. The flame licked the bony plate. The creature recoiled. The fire didn't harm it, but the light blinded its slit-like eyes. Henrik ran up with an axe and struck at its hind legs. The bronze axe severed a tendon.
The creature howled and sank to its hind legs. Enric struck again and again. The panther collapsed. The third creature spun around and ran toward the breach in the wall. It was fleeing, but it didn't get away. A stone flew out of the darkness beyond the wall, a heavy one. It struck the panther in the head. It stumbled. Una appeared out of nowhere. She'd been behind the wall the whole time. She leaped onto the panther's back and drove a sharpened stone into the joint between its armor plate and neck. The creature fell. Una rolled off it and stood up. She didn't have a single scratch on her. And then the big one came. The ground shook violently. Hyun could feel the vibration through the feet. He climbed onto the wall and looked. A creature the size of a bull was emerging from the jungle. No, bigger. 6 legs. Its body was covered not with hide, but with solid bone armor, segmented like a beetle's. Each segment was as thick as a palm. Its head was small and also encased in armor. No eyes, no slits. Blind. But it moved with confidence, as if it could see with something else. It was heading straight for the wall, slowly, unhurriedly. Do-hyun watched it and realized the wall wouldn't hold. The wall wouldn't hold, spears wouldn't pierce that armor, and the moat wouldn't stop it. This was a test for which he had no answer. Do-hyun jumped down from the wall and ran toward the workshop. Bronze won't help, bone won't help, iron won't help. He grabbed his grandfather's knife. He opened it. He looked at the blade. Carbon steel, hardened to 60 on the Rockwell scale. The hardest thing he had. But that wasn't enough. He didn't need something hard. He needed something hot. He looked at the furnace, at the coals still smoldering in the pit, at the bellows, at the bronze cauldron he'd cast 3 days ago. Oil. He needed oil. Emily had said there was a tree on the island with oily fruits. They had a supply, not much, a liter or 2, for cooking. He grabbed the clay jug of oil,
Poured it into the bronze cauldron, placed the cauldron in the furnace, pumped the bellows. The oil began to heat up, to smoke. The ground shook. The creature was approaching. 50 meters to the wall, 40, 30. The oil came to a boil. Do-hyun grabbed the cauldron with tongs made of 2 sticks. It was heavy, 1.5 liters of boiling oil. He ran toward the wall. He climbed the ladder to the platform. The creature was 10 meters away. The wall trembled with every step it took. Do-hyun looked down at it from above. Segmented armor. Seams between the segments. Cracks. Narrow, but they were there. He swung the pot and splashed the boiling oil onto the creature's back. The oil ran down its armor and seeped into the joints between the segments. The creature stopped. Its body twitched. Steam began to rise from the gaps between the plates. Then the creature made a sound. Not a roar, not a screech. A muffled, drawn-out groan that made his ears ring. It backed away. The oil boiled in the joints of its armor, searing the soft tissue beneath the shell. The creature turned and headed back toward the jungle. Slowly, with difficulty. Steam rose from its back into the night sky. It was gone. Do-hyun stood on the platform, holding an empty cauldron. His hands were scorched. His shoulder ached from the weight. He watched as the creature vanished into the darkness and thought, it wasn't dead. It had just left. It will return. And next time, there might not be enough oil. He needed something else, something he didn't have yet. But today they had held out. He climbed down from the wall. People were standing in the courtyard watching him, dirty, bloodied, weapons in hand. Alive. All alive. Not a single casualty. Annabeth was already bandaging Grant's shoulder, which the creature had pinned to the ground. Henrik sat staring at his axe. The blade was covered in black blood. Ha-un stood by the fire, holding her folding knife. Opened. She hadn't used it in battle, but she was ready. You could tell by the way she held it. Do-hyun looked at the hole in the wall. He'd fix it tomorrow. He looked at the dead creatures. He'd gut them tomorrow. He looked at his burned hands. Annabeth approached silently, took his hands and began to examine them. The burns were superficial, painful but not dangerous. She treated them with aloe juice that Emily had found a week ago. She bandaged them with strips of clean cloth. Then she looked at him and told him to eat and go to sleep. She'd check on him again in the morning.
Her voice was stern, like an older sister's. Do-hyun nodded, but he didn't go to sleep. He sat down by the fire and took out his grandfather's knife. He opened it. He looked at the blade. It glinted in the firelight. An old knife, once rusty, now polished to a mirror finish. With a handle he'd re-gripped himself. This knife had been with him from day one, from that first night when he sat on the sand and stared into the darkness. The knife his grandfather had given him. His grandfather who knew about this island, who had been here. Do-hyun held the knife up to the light and looked at the handle. On the inside of the guard, where his finger rested when he gripped it, he'd never looked there closely before. Now he looked, and he saw them, carved finely, almost worn away by time. 2 characters, his grandfather's name, and next to it, another mark, not a character, a symbol, a circle with 3 lines radiating from the center. He didn't know what it meant, but he'd seen the same symbol today, on the bone plate of a large, 6-legged creature, the exact same symbol. Carved into the bone, or perhaps it had grown there. Do-hyun sat there, staring at the knife. The night was quiet, the creatures were gone, everyone was asleep. Only Ha-eun was awake. She sat across from him and looked at him across the campfire. She didn't ask any questions, she was just there. On the 42nd day, Do-hyun found his grandfather's hut. Yuna led him there. She had known about it for a long time. She had been waiting until he was ready to see it. They walked deep into the island for 3 hours, past animal trails, past the nests Yuna had mentioned, past trees 5 arm spans thick that had stood there for hundreds of years. The jungle was changing. Closer to the mountain, the air felt different, heavier, thicker, as if you were breathing water. The sounds changed too. The birds fell silent, the insects vanished. Only the rustling of leaves and a muffled, rhythmic sound coming from beneath the ground, like a pulse. Yuna stopped in a clearing at the foot of a rocky outcrop. The clearing was round, perfectly round. The grass there was shorter than in the jungle, as if someone had mowed it, or as if it didn't want to grow any taller on its own. In the center of the clearing stood a hut, small, made of stone and wood. The roof had collapsed, the walls were still standing. The doorway gaped into the darkness. Do-hyun approached. He touched the wall. The stones had been laid without mortar, simply fitted together so tightly that not even a blade could slip between them. Masterful work. The work of a man who understood stone. He stepped inside. The floor was dirt. In the corner stood a stone workbench. Tools lay on it, rusty, crumbling, but he recognized them. A hammer, pliers, a file, a punch, a blacksmith's tools. Next to the workbench was a pit in the floor lined with stones, a furnace just like his. The same proportions, the same depth, the same principle. Do-hyun crouched down by the workbench and ran his hand over its surface. The stone was smooth, polished by thousands of touches. Someone had worked here for years. He looked at the beam above the door, and he saw it. Korean characters carved deep and crisp. His grandfather's name, Kang Byung-chul. Next to it, another name, a woman's. Not Korean. Latin letters, but the carving style was the same. The same hand, the same depth, the same knife. Isla. Just Isla. Do-hyun stood there, staring at those names. His grandfather had been here, a long time ago, a very long time ago. He'd lived here, worked here. He knew this island. He'd walked the same path. Knives, fire, stone, bone. He did the same things Do-hyun was doing now, because he knew how to do the same things.
because his hands were the same. Yuna stood in the doorway. Du-Yun turned to her and asked if she knew. Yuna nodded. She said that when she came to the island 2 years ago, the hut was already empty, but the tools were there and the names on the beam. And something else. She walked over to the far wall and moved a stone at the base. Behind the stone was a niche. In the niche lay a bundle wrapped in hide, old, dry, crumbling. Inside was a knife, not rusty, not broken, intact. A blade 1.5 palms long, steel with a pattern on the surface, wavy lines, Damascus steel. Her grandfather's knife had been made of carbon steel, but this one was different. Du-Yun took it in his hands and his fingers lit up. Information poured in like a torrent. Layers, hundreds of layers, soft iron and hard steel fused into a single whole. But it wasn't just steel. It contained carbon from the creature's bones, phosphorus from their blood, calcium from their shells. His grandfather had forged this blade from the island's materials. He had achieved what Du-Hyun was only just beginning to grasp. He had united metal and bone, steel and creature, human craftsmanship and the island's gift.
Do-Hyun held the blade up to the light. The pattern on the steel shimmered. It didn't reflect the light, it radiated it, faintly, barely noticeable. A bluish glow along the lines of the pattern. Living metal. Do-Hyun stepped out of the hut and sat down on the grass, his grandfather's knife in one hand, his own grandfather's folding knife in the other. 2 knives. One his grandfather had taken with him when he left the island, the other he'd left behind. Why? Yuna sat down beside him. She was silent for a long time. And she spoke, more than she ever had before. She said that the island offers a choice, to those who make it to the end, to those who pass all the trials and climb the mountain. The island bestows a gift and offers 2 paths. Take the gift and leave, or stay and become the guardian. The guardian protects the island, watches over the creatures, watches over the current, watches over those who end up here. The previous guardian was a human, a long time ago. He left, and the island was left without a guardian. The creatures grew wild, the current grew stronger, more ships began to wreck, more people began to perish. The island called for a new guardian. It called for a long time. No one made it all the way to the end. Until Hyun asked how she knew all this. Yuna looked at the mountain, then at him. She said that the island speaks to her, not with words, not with a voice, through images, through dreams. She senses it as a living being, ever since the day she arrived here. She thought she was going mad, then she got used to it. Do-Hyun sat and thought. Then he asked the most important question. His grandfather had made it to the end. He had climbed the mountain. He had received the gift. He had chosen to leave. Why? Yuna shook her head. She didn't know. The island hadn't told her that part. But the knife her grandfather left in the hut, it wasn't just a knife. It was a key. Without it, the door at the top of the mountain wouldn't open. The ship appeared on the 45th day, a 2-masted sloop with a black hull. It glided into the cove at dawn like a knife through butter, quietly, confidently. The man at the helm knew these waters. He knew the currents. He knew how to enter and how to leave. Ji-Min was the first to spot it from the top of a tree and slid down so fast that she scraped the skin off her palms. She burst through the gate and said one word. Co-slave. Do-Hyun climbed up onto the wall. He looked out. The sloop had dropped anchor 100 meters from the shore. Figures were moving on deck. He counted 12 men, all armed. Sabers, muskets. One man stood at the bow, looking toward the shore through a spyglass. Tall, in a long, dark cloak, a wide-brimmed hat. He stood motionless, and only the telescope moved slowly along the shore, from left to right. From the large camp to the fortress. Then it stopped on the fortress. The man lowered the telescope and said something to the man standing next to him. An hour later, the sloop was launched, 4 men at the oars, a 5th at the stern. Not the tall one, another man.
The rowboat touched down in the sand near the large camp. The bosun came out to meet them. The conversation didn't last long. Then the rowboat pushed off and headed along the shore toward the fortress. Do-hyun went down and stood by the gate. Ha-eun was beside him, Grant with a spear, Henrik with an axe, Park with a knife. The rowboat pulled up to the shore. A man stepped out of it, young, no older than 25, dark hair tied back in a ponytail, an earring in his ear, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He walked up to the gate and stopped by the moat. He looked at the wall, at the bone plates embedded in the bamboo, at the bronze hinges on the gate, at the spearheads glinting above the wall. Then he looked at Do-hyun and spoke. He said that his captain, Sila from Cross, invites the fortress's lord aboard for a conversation, that the conversation is peaceful, that the captain is interested in trade, that he's heard of a master who forges blades better than those in Europe, that he's ready to offer something the island lacks: gunpowder, fabric, tools, medicines, steel, real steel, in exchange for the master's work. Do-hyun listened. Then he asked how the captain knew about the current and how to navigate back out. The man smiled even wider. He said that Captain Cross had been sailing these waters for 20 years, that he was the only one who knew the passage, the current, that it was his personal secret and his personal business. He visits the archipelago once every 6 months. He collects whatever he finds: tools, weapons, valuables from shipwrecks, sometimes people, those who want to leave, for a fee. Do-hyun looked at him and thought. Then he said he wouldn't come aboard. If the captain wants to talk, let him come ashore, to my wall. The man shrugged. He walked over to the rowboat and sailed away. 2 hours later, the rowboat returned. This time, Silas Cross himself was sitting in it.
Do-hyun recognized him by his coat and hat. Up close, the captain turned out to be older than he'd looked from a distance, over 50. His face was harsh and weather-beaten, with deep wrinkles around his eyes. His beard was streaked with gray. His eyes were gray, cold, and very observant. He stepped out of the rowboat and approached the gate alone. His men stayed by the water. He stood there and looked at the fortress for a long time, in silence. Then he nodded. He said he was impressed, that in 20 years of visits he'd seen many camps here, huts, tents, dugouts, but this was the first time he'd seen a fortress with a wall, a gate, and a workshop. Do-hyun brought out a stool and placed it outside the gate. Grant brought a second stool. They sat across from each other. Do-hyun was inside the perimeter, Cross was outside. A moat lay between them. Cross spoke up. His proposal was simple. Do-hyun would go with him aboard the ship. He would work in the ship's smithy. He'll forge blades and tools. Cross will pay him a share of the profits. In a year or two, Do-hyun will be a free man with enough money to start a new life in any port in the world. Do-hyun listened. Then he asked what would happen to the others, the people in the fortress and the people in the large camp. Cross shrugged. He said that wasn't his concern, that his ship wasn't a passenger vessel, that he only took on those who were useful. The craftsman was useful. The rest weren't. Do-hyun shook his head. He said no. Cross wasn't surprised. It was as if he'd been expecting that answer. He stood up. He said he'd think about another offer. Then he sailed away. Ha-eun stood behind the gates and listened. When the boat pulled away, she approached Do-hyun and asked if he believed Cross would accept the refusal. Do-hyun replied that he didn't. He didn't believe it. He knew the type. People like that used to come to the factory to buy technology. If you wouldn't sell, they'd try to buy it cheaper. If that didn't work, they'd try to steal it. If that failed too, they'd try to break it. Cross would be back. 3 tense days passed. The ship lay at anchor in the cove. Every day, rowboats were lowered from it. Cross's men roamed the island. They collected metal from the wreckage. They hunted. They gathered fresh water. They didn't go near the fortress, but Ji-min saw them in the jungle. They were counting people, counting weapons, counting the height of the walls. On the 3rd day, a girl came to the fortress gates, alone, unarmed, red hair tied in a braid, a leather jacket, high boots, green eyes that stared straight ahead without blinking. She introduced herself as Catherine O'Reilly, the daughter of Silas Cross. She said she hadn't come on her father's behalf. She said she'd come of her own accord. She wanted to see the master's blades. Do-hyun looked at her. Then he opened the gates. She entered. She walked past Grant and Henrik without looking at them. She stopped by the workshop. She looked at the anvil, at the hides, at the forge, at the blanks laid out on the stone. Then she picked up a bronze knife from the table and turned it over in her hands. She snorted, put it back. She picked up a bone tip, ran her finger along the edge, raised an eyebrow, looked at Do-hyun. She said her father doesn't take no for an answer, that if Do-hyun didn't go willingly, they'd take him by force, that her father had 12 men with muskets and 2 falconets on board. Against a bamboo wall, that was a death sentence. She said this calmly, without a hint of threat, as if stating a fact. Do-hyun nodded. He asked why she was telling him this. Kat paused. Then she said she didn't know. That she was tired of watching her father take people away, that she'd been on this ship since she was 12, and in 13 years she'd seen nothing but the ocean and other people's suffering. That her father used her as a negotiator because people trusted her more than they trusted him, and she was tired. Do-hyun listened. Then he asked how much time they had. Kat said her father would wait a week. He always waits a week. Then he takes action. Do-hyun nodded. A week. 7 days. That's enough. Do-hyun worked for 7 days straight. The first thing he did was unite the camps. He went to see the bosun himself. He stood before him and said that in a week a ship carrying cannons and muskets would arrive. That they had 2 options, die separately or survive together. The bosun was silent for a long time. Then he asked what needed to be done. Do-hyun said one word: build. In 7 days, 38 men rebuilt the fortress. They raised the wall to 3 meters, reinforcing it with clay and stone. They embedded bone plates every 30 centimeters, heat-treated ones harder than steel. During a test, a musket ball penetrated a plate 1/3 of its length and got stuck. It didn't pierce through. Do-hyun watched this and nodded. Good. He completely rebuilt the gates. They were double. The outer gates were made of bamboo and hides. The inner gates were made of stone and bone. There was a space 2 steps wide between them, a trap. If attackers breach the outer gates, they'll find themselves in a stone corridor between the 2 sets of doors. And above is a platform from which one can pour boiling oil, throw stones, and thrust with spears. He built 4 towers at the corners, made of stone, bamboo, and clay, 4 meters high. Each platform held 2 people, with a view in all directions. Shields made of bone plates lined the perimeter of the platform. One could hide behind them from arrows. He made weapons, 20 spears with tips of heat-treated bone. 10 of them were for throwing, short and heavy, with fletching made of stiff leaves. 4 long pikes for defending the wall. The pike was planted in the ground to prevent the enemy from climbing over. 12 knives, 1 for each person who didn't already have one, 1 for each hand. Then he did something no one expected. He made a bow. Not just 1, 3. Bamboo limbs with plates of the creature's bone on the outer side. A composite. Bamboo resists compression. Bone resists tension. Together they provide a strength that wood lacks. The bowstring was made of braided tendons. The arrows had bone tips and feather fletching that Emily had been collecting for weeks. Finn turned out to be an archer. He had shot a bow as a child in Ireland. He drew the bowstring, fired, and the arrow flew 80 meters and embedded itself in the trunk of a palm tree to the depth of a finger. Finn looked at the bow and said it was the best weapon he'd ever held. Do-hyun said the compliment was flattering, but they were short on arrows, only 30 in total. They had to aim only when absolutely certain. He positioned his men. Ha-un kept track of their positions. She drew a map of the fortress on a piece of bark and marked each name at its respective spot. The 4 best archers on the towers, spearmen on the walls, a reserve group inside. Annabeth was taking cover under a canopy with tools and a supply of bandages. Martha was helping her. Emily was preparing incendiary torches, tar balls wrapped in cloth and mounted on sticks. They burned brightly and for a long time, for night combat. Liz and 2 others were preparing cauldrons of oil over bonfires at the gate and along the western wall. Yuna had gone into the jungle. She was doing her job.
She was setting new traps along the creatures' trails. Not for the creatures, for people.
If the people of the cross tried to come through the jungle instead of along the beach, the traps would meet them. Jimin didn't come down from the trees. She watched the ship day and night. She counted the people. She counted the weapons. She reported that there were 12 people on board, 2 falconets at the bow and stern, 8 muskets. Each man had a saber. The gunpowder was stored in a barrel on the lower deck. Do-hyun listened and did the math. 12 against 38. But they had gunpowder and lead, and he had bamboo and bone. Numerical superiority wouldn't save them if a falconet breached the wall. He needed to neutralize the ship. Do-hyun thought about it for 2 days. Then he went to see Kat. She was still in the fortress. She hadn't gone to the ship. She hadn't warned her father. She'd simply stayed behind. She was helping Marta sew protective breastplates from the hides of various creatures. She worked quietly and efficiently. Do-hyun asked if the ship could get closer to the shore, closer than it was now. Kat said no. The bay was shallow. The draft wouldn't allow it within 100 meters of the shore. The falconets have a range of 200, but their effective range is 100. Accuracy drops with the ship's roll. Do-hyun nodded. 100 meters. A falconet can hit a wall from 100 meters away. A wall reinforced with bone plates can withstand a musket ball, but a falconet's cannonball is half a pound of iron. The wall won't hold up, he thought. Then he found a solution, not in strength, in cunning. The 6th day, Do-hyun finished his final weapon for himself. Not a knife, not a spear, not a bow, a blade. He took his grandfather's Damascus knife from the hut, the key, and began to rework it. Not to break it, not to reforge it, to improve it. He took apart the handle, examined the tang, sturdy, solid. His grandfather had done a fine job. He made a new handle from the bone of a large beast. He wrapped it in hide. He shaped it to fit his hand. Then he sharpened the blade, not on a stone, on a plate of heat-treated bone. The bone was harder than stone and produced a finer grain. The edge turned out so sharp that a hair would be cut from a distance. The blade glowed. The blue lines of the pattern burned brighter than before, as if the knife knew its master had returned, as if it had been waiting for these hands. Do-hyun did one more thing on that last day. He made a saber for Kiet,
from the anchor chain that Jimin had found on the east coast. The links were made of good iron. He reforged 3 links into a strip. He fused it with bone powder in the furnace at maximum temperature. The result was steel with bone carbon, strong and flexible. He forged the blade, curved and lightweight, tailored to her height and her hand. The balance was set 4 fingers from the guard. He cast the guard from bronze. The hilt was made of bone wrapped in leather. He called out to Kat. She approached. He handed her the saber. She took it. She weighed it in her hand. She made 2 test swings. The blade whistled. She looked at him and asked how much it cost. Do-hyun replied that it wasn't for sale, that it was already hers. Kat stood there looking at the saber, then at him. Something in her expression shifted. She gripped the hilt and nodded briefly. She didn't say thank you, but in the way she sheathed the saber at her waist, in the way her hand rested on the hilt, in the way her shoulders straightened,
Everything had been said. The assault began at dawn on the 53rd day. Cross didn't wait the whole week. He struck a day early. Clever. He was counting on the fortress not being ready. But the fortress was ready. Ji-min spotted the rowboats while it was still dark. 3 of them, 4 men in each, 12 men, the entire crew. The ship remained empty at anchor. Do-hyun stood on the western tower and watched. The rowboats were heading toward the shore. Cross was sitting in the first one. He was on the tower too. A falconet taken from the ship jutted out from the bow of the skiff, a small cannon on a swivel. Do-hyun saw it and cursed in Korean. He hadn't expected Cross to remove the falconet from the ship and mount it on the skiff. Mobile artillery. The boats ground into the sand. Cross's men poured onto the shore, quickly, in an organized manner. Half of them, armed with muskets, took up positions behind rocks and tree trunks on the beach. The other half dragged the falconet to a position 100 paces from the wall, a direct line of fire toward the gate. Do-hyun climbed down from the tower. He shouted for everyone to move away from the gate. The men scattered to the sides. A minute later, a shot boomed. The cannonball struck the left gate leaf. The bamboo and hide burst. The bone plates flew apart. The outer gate collapsed, but the inner gate remained standing, made of stone with bone plating. The cannonball struck the second gate. The stonework cracked, but it didn't collapse. The bone plates absorbed the impact and distributed the force across the surface, just as Hyun had calculated. Cross reloaded and fired again. The third cannonball flew to the left and struck the wall next to the gate. The wall cracked, but held. Cross cursed. Reloading the falconet took 2 minutes. During those 2 minutes, Do-hyun sent Finn and 2 archers to the south tower. From there, it was 80 meters to the falconet. Maximum range. But the arrows with bone tips flew straight and heavy. Finn fired. The first arrow flew too low and stuck in the sand a meter from the falconet. The second hit the artilleryman in the shoulder. He fell. The third struck the wooden of the falconet. Cross retreated behind the rocks. The falconet fell silent. The musketeers opened fire. Bullets pounded against the wall and the bone shields on the towers. One passed through a crack and struck Henrik in the arm. He growled, clutched his forearm, and sat down. Annabeth was by his side within 10 seconds. The bullet had passed straight through without touching the bone. She bandaged him right there against the wall. Henrik stood up and raised the axe again, with his left hand. The muskets fired methodically, but the wall with its bone plates held firm. The bullets struck the bone and got stuck, just as Do-hyun had calculated. Heat-treated bone is denser than soft iron. Cross realized that ranged combat wasn't working. Half an hour later, the firing died down. Then the movement began. Cross's men dragged ladders up to the wall, 3 of them nailed together from ship planks. They ran across the beach, taking cover behind musket fire. Spearmen on the walls were waiting. The first ladder was set up against the western wall. 2 men began climbing up. Grant thrust his spear into the first man's chest. He fell. The second grabbed the edge of the wall and was struck in the face with a halberd. The halberd knocked him down. The ladder was knocked over. A second ladder was set up against the south wall. Pack and another sailor met the attackers with spears. One of Cross's men climbed onto the wall and swung his saber. Pack dodged and stabbed him in the side with a knife. The man doubled over and fell inside the fortress. Finn shot the next man on the ladder. The arrow hit his leg. The ladder wobbled and collapsed. A third ladder was set up at the gate. 3 of them scrambled up at once. These were Cross's best fighters, experienced and fast. The first one leaped over the wall and landed on the platform above the gate. The space between the outer and inner gates was directly beneath him. He didn't know about the trap. The platform beneath him collapsed. Do-hyun removed the prop a second before the pirate landed. The man fell down into the stone corridor between the gates onto the spikes at the bottom. The second pirate leaped onto the wall and found himself face to face with Kat. She was standing on the wall, saber in hand.
The pirate recognized her. He froze for a second. That second was enough. Cat struck, not at his body, at his musket. The saber sliced through the wooden stock. The musket fell apart. The pirate drew a knife. Cat parried and counterattacked. 2 strikes, quick, precise. The pirate retreated and tumbled off the wall. The third one didn't climb up. He'd seen what had happened to the first 2. The ladder was hauled back. The firing ceased. Cross retreated. He regrouped. 6 of his 12 men were wounded or out of action. The falconet was silent. The wall stood. Dohyun walked around the fortress. Casualties. Henrik was wounded in the arm. 1 sailor from the former bosun's quarters had a saber cut on his shoulder. Nothing else. Everyone was alive. He stood on the wall and watched the retreating pirates. Cross stood on the beach by the rocks and looked at the fortress. Even from a distance of 100 meters, Dohyun could see his eyes, cold, calculating, not angry. Cross wasn't angry. He was calculating. He was weighing his options. Dohyun knew that the assault wasn't the end of it. Cross would return, at night, when darkness gave him the advantage, and he'd bring the creatures with him. Not because he commanded them, but because he knew. 20 years on the archipelago had taught him a lot. He knew that the creatures were drawn to noise and fire, that if they lit a fire in the right spot and beat the drum, the creatures would come. And then the fortress would have to fight on 2 fronts, against the people and against the creatures at the same time. Dohyun turned to Yuna. She was standing by the wall, silent as always. He asked if she could make sure the creatures didn't come that night. Yuna was silent. Then she said she'd try. And she went into the jungle. The night of the 53rd day was quiet. Yuna did what she promised. The beasts didn't come. Dohyun didn't ask how she did it.
He saw her go into the jungle, and how the jungle accepted her. She was part of the island, more so than any of them. The fortress did not sleep. Bonfires burned on every tower. Guards stood on the walls. Dohyun sat in the workshop and worked. He was making one last thing, not a weapon, not a tool, a gift for everyone. He took each fighter's weapon, quietly, without asking. Grant's spear, Finn's bow, Henrik's axe, Pock's knife, Annabeth's scalpel, Haun's knife, Jimin's blade, Cat's saber. He examined every weapon. He sharpened each one, rebalanced them. He tightened the wrappings. He replaced a chipped tip. And on each one, he carved a symbol, a small one, on the handle or the pommel. Grant's had a crab. He used to say that as a child he caught crabs on the shore. Finn's had a fish. Henrik's had a tree. Pock's had a mountain. Annabeth's had a cross, not a religious one, but her last name. Haun's had a flower. She once said she missed the flowers near her home in Korea. Jimin has a bird. She didn't say anything, but he saw how she watched the birds every morning. Cat has a wave. She was the daughter of the sea, even though she hated her father. He worked until dawn. Then he laid out the weapons next to the sleeping people, each in its place, next to their owner. In the morning, they woke up and found their belongings, sharpened, rebalanced, with new markings. No one had ordered anything. He just did it. Grant twirled his spear in his hands. He saw the crab. He froze. Then he swallowed and nodded. He didn't say a word. Finn ran his finger over the fish on the bow and whistled softly. Henrik looked at the wood on his axe and placed his hand on the butt. He just placed it there and held it. Haun opened her folding knife and saw a flower. She closed the knife, opened it again, looked at it once more, then pressed it to her chest. Jimin sat on a branch and looked at the bird carved on its blade. She didn't come down for a long time. When she did come down, her eyes were red. She didn't say anything. She just stood to Dohyun and stood there. Annabeth opened the case and saw that every tool had been sharpened and a cross had appeared on each handle. She looked across the courtyard at Dohyun.
Then she shook her head and smiled. Her first real smile in a long time. Kat drew her saber from its scabbard. The wave pattern on the hilt glistened in the morning light. She didn't look at Do-hyun, but her hand rested on the hilt differently, more gently, as if she were holding something alive. These people stood with weapons he had crafted.
Each with a weapon made to fit his hand, each with a mark that said he had been thought of, not just in general, personally, by name. Do-hyun looked at them and thought that this alone was worth staying awake for. Cross's second assault began at noon. He changed his tactics. He didn't scale the walls. He didn't fire from the falconet. He set a fire. His men set dry grass ablaze on the windward side, and the smoke crept toward the fortress, thick and acrid. The men on the walls began to cough, their eyes watered. Visibility dropped to 0. Under cover of the smoke, Cross's men crept up to the wall, close, very close. Do-hyun heard a scraping sound. They were digging under the wall with shovels from the ship. If they dug out the foundation, the wall would collapse. Neither stone nor clay would help if the support is gone. Do-hyun shouted for them to pour oil. They tipped the cauldron onto the wall. Boiling oil flowed down. A scream from outside. 2 of them jumped back, but one kept digging. Grant leaned over the wall and thrust his spear downward. He hit his mark. The digger fell. The smoke was clearing. The wind was shifting. Cross stood on the beach and watched. 4 remained beside him. 4 out of 12. The rest were wounded or lay against the wall. He had lost. He knew it. Do-hyun could see it in his shoulders, in the way he stood. A captain who lost ships and crews. A captain who always found a way out. Now there was no way out. Do-hyun climbed down from the wall. He opened the inner gate. He stepped out through the breach in the outer gate, alone, with his grandfather's sword at his belt. He walked along the beach toward Cross. Ha-yun shouted after him to stop. He didn't stop. Grant wanted to follow him. Kat stopped him with a hand. She said it was between them. Do-hyun approached Cross. They stood on the beach facing each other. Cross placed his hand on the hilt of his saber. Do-hyun didn't touch his blade. He said that Cross had lost, that his men were wounded, that his ship was empty, that he could leave now, take the wounded and leave, or stay and lose everything. Cross looked at him for a long time. Then he asked, "What about Catherine?" Do-hyun replied that Kat decides for herself where she wants to be, that he isn't holding anyone back, that the fortress gates are open in both directions. Cross was silent. Then his shoulders slumped. Not much, just a centimeter, but Do-hyun saw it. He took his hand off his saber. He turned to his men and ordered them to load up. They were leaving. The boats pushed off from the shore, slowly, with difficulty, carrying the wounded and without any loot. Cross sat at the stern of the last boat and looked at the fortress, then at the figure of Kat standing on the wall. He raised his hand. He didn't wave, he just raised it and lowered it. The boat weighed anchor, the sails filled with wind. The black hull turned toward the exit from the bay, and it was gone. Do-hyun stood on the beach and watched until the ship became a dot on the horizon. Then he turned toward the fortress. The gates were open. People were standing on the walls, watching him. 38 people, alive, unharmed, holding weapons he had made. He walked back. Ha-yun was standing by the gate. She didn't say anything. She just handed him a cup of water. He drank it. That evening, they ate together, all 38 of them, around a large bonfire in the center of the fortress. Fish and meat and boiled roots and bitter tea made from Emily's leaves. Grant told a story about a whale. Finn argued with him about the size. Henrik silently ate his third helping. Pak drank tea and nodded to himself about something. Martha was mending someone's shirt by the fire. Liz was discussing planting beans with Emily. Annabeth was bandaging Henrik's arm and scolding him for swinging an axe with a wound that hadn't healed yet.
The bosun sat off to the side. He was silent, but he ate along with everyone else. His axe, the very one that Du-hyun had refitted in the early days, lay on the ground nearby. Du-hyun noticed that over the past few weeks, the bosun had scrubbed all the rust off it and wrapped the handle in fresh leather. He'd taken good care of it. Ji-min sat on a branch above the campfire, tossing berry pits down into Finn's cup. Finn flinched every time and looked back. Ji-min put on an innocent face. Kat sat next to Ha-eun. They were talking quietly. Du-hyun couldn't hear what they were saying, but Ha-eun was nodding, and for the first time in a long while, Kat looked calm. Not on guard, not ready for a fight. Calm. Yuna sat right at the edge of the campfire, on the border between light and shadow. She ate in silence. A comb stuck out of her hair, which was now combed and braided into a plait. Someone had taught her how to braid her hair. Maybe Ha-eun, maybe Martha. Du-hyun didn't know, but it was a good thing. Du-hyun sat and watched them. Then he stood up.
He walked over to Yuna. He sat down next to her. She looked at him. He said he was ready. Yuna nodded. On the morning of the 54th day, Du-hyun got ready. His grandfather's blade was on his belt, a pocket knife in his pocket, a water flask, nothing else. He walked out the gate at dawn. Ha-eun was standing by the gate. She didn't ask him to stay. She handed him a bundle of food, fish and roots wrapped in a leaf. He took it. Their hands touched. She didn't pull away. Neither did he. They stood like that for a second. Then she stepped back and told him to come back. She didn't ask. She told him, as if it were a fact. He nodded. Emily ran up at the last moment and shoved her notebook into his hand. She told him to write down everything he saw on the mountain, every rock, every plant, every mineral. He smiled and tucked the notebook into his shirt. Ji-min stood on the wall and watched from above. She didn't come down. She didn't say a word. But when he looked at her, she raised her knife, that very one, the one with the bird on the handle. She raised it and nodded. He nodded back. Annabeth stood in the doorway of the shed with her arms crossed. She told him not to dare come back injured because she was tired of patching him up. Her voice was harsh. Her eyes were empty. Kat stood by the wall with a saber at her belt. She said that if he didn't come back, she'd personally climb that mountain and drag him out by the collar. Du-hyun looked at her and said he believed her. Yuna was waiting outside the gate. They set off. The journey to the mountain took half a day, through the jungle, past grandfather's hut, past the creatures' nests. The creatures weren't visible. They parted before Yuna. Du-hyun saw them standing in the shadows between the trees, watching. But they didn't move. They didn't attack. Yuna walked, and they backed away, as if she were one of them, or above them. The climb began after noon. The mountain was steep. A rocky path wound between boulders. The air grew colder. The vegetation thinned out. Halfway up the climb, Du-hyun stopped and looked back. Below, the island stretched out, green, vibrant. He could see the beach, the fortress, a tiny wisp of smoke from a campfire. He could see the other islands of the archipelago on the horizon, distant and hazy. He could see the ocean, endless and blue. And he saw the current, a dark band in the water that encircled the archipelago like a ring. From here, it was clear that this was no natural phenomenon. The current was too regular, too smooth, as if someone had drawn it. Yuna stood beside him, silent, waiting. They walked on. The summit opened up suddenly, the trail ended, and they emerged onto a flat clearing the size of their fortress. In the center stood a stone, not a boulder, a pillar, smooth and black, as tall as a man. There were lines on its surface, that same symbol, a circle with 3 rays, just like on the hilt of his grandfather's knife, just like on the carapace of the 6-legged creature. Du-hyun approached. He drew his grandfather's blade. The blue lines of the pattern glowed brightly. The knife was drawn to the stone, literally. Du-hyun felt a force in the hilt, like a magnet.
He lifted the blade and inserted it into a groove on the surface of the pillar. The groove was carved to fit the blade exactly, a perfect match. The knife slid in. The stone hummed, a low, deep sound that came from beneath the earth and rose upward through his feet, through his knees, through his spine, into his head. The lines on the stone glowed blue, the same color as the pattern on the blade. The light traveled down the stone into the earth, and the earth responded. Dahyun saw, not with his eyes, with something else. He saw the entire island, all its layers, the roots of trees, the burrows of creatures, underground rivers, caves, and deep below, beneath the mountain, a pulsating core, alive, warm. It was the island, its heart. It beat slowly and powerfully, 1 beat per minute. Each beat sent a wave of warmth throughout the archipelago. Each beat nourished the creatures, nourished the trees, nourished the current. The island was alive, not as a metaphor, literally, an organism the size of a mountain range. The creatures were its antibodies, its defense system. The current was its circulatory system. The people who ended up here were to it something between parasites and symbionts. Those who merely survived were neutral. Those who built and created attracted attention. The creatures flocked to them like white blood cells to a foreign body. They tested them. If a person passed the test, the island began to accept him as a symbiont, as a part of itself. Grandfather had walked this path. He had climbed up here. He had received a gift. And he had left. Why had he left? Dahyun saw this too. In the flood of images that poured from the stone was a single memory, not his, someone else's, an old one. A young man with a face resembling Dahyun's stands in this very spot. A woman stands beside him. Isla.
The one whose name is on the beam of the hut. She's holding his hand. She's crying. The man looks at her, then at the stone, then at the ocean below. He makes a choice. He takes the gift and leaves, because across the ocean he has a son, a little boy, whom he left behind when his ship was caught in a current. He leaves for his son's sake. He takes the knife, a small folding knife, the token, and he leaves the blade, the key, in the hut, because he knows that one day someone will come, someone of his blood, with his hands, with his eyes, who will pick up the key and see it through to the end. Grandfather knew. He'd known his whole life, and when he gave his grandson that rusty folding knife, he knew he was sending him home. The island was waiting. The stone was waiting. All this time. Dahyun stood with his hands on the stone, tears streaming down his face. He hadn't cried since childhood. Now he was crying. Not out of grief, out of understanding. For that, the stone presented him with a choice. 2 paths. Take the gift, boundless mastery, the ability to see right through any material, to sense any object, to create what the world has never seen. Take it and leave. The current will open up. He'll be able to drift away, return to his world, to his own time. Or stay. Become the guardian, the one who watches over the island, the one who guides the creatures, the one who decides whom the current will let in and whom it will let go, the one who waits on the mountain until the next one arrives. Dahyun removed his hands from the stone. The glow faded, the sound subsided. He stood on the mountaintop and looked down at the island, at the fortress, at the smoke from the campfire. He thought of Haun, who keeps track of everything and silently places water next to his hand, of Emily, who records his every move and calls him a rare species, about Ji-min, who sleeps on a branch with a knife at her belt and lets no one but him near her, about Annabeth, who grumbles and makes sure he eats, about Kat, who chose his side over her own father, O Yoon, who waited 2 years for someone, and she waited in vain. He thought of Grant with a crab on his spear, of Finn with a fish on his bow, about Henrik with a tree on his axe, about the 38 people sleeping behind his wall,
with weapons he had made, under a roof he had helped build. He thought about his grandfather's choice. His grandfather had left for his son's sake. Do-hyun could have left.
He had no one in that world. The conference in Jakarta, an empty apartment in Seoul, a factory that would replace him in a week. No one was waiting for him there. Everyone was waiting for him here. He turned to Yuna. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, looking at him silently, without expectation, without pressure, just looking. He said he was staying, but not like that. Not alone on the mountain, not a guardian in a cave. He was staying down below, with them, in the fortress, by the campfire, with tools in his hands. He would be a guardian in his own way, not the one waiting on the mountain, but one who builds at the foot of the mountain. The stone hummed again, quietly, approvingly, as if that were the right answer, as if the island had been waiting for exactly that. Not a hermit, not a guard, a craftsman, one who stays among the people and makes things for their hands. Do-hyun pulled the blade from its sheath, tucked it into his belt, looked at Yuna. She smiled. He saw her smile for the first time, quiet, small, genuine. She spoke the words he had both been waiting for and not waiting for at the same time. She said that the island had accepted him, that she would show him the way forward. They began their descent. Do-hyun walked, feeling the island beneath his feet, every stone, every root, every layer of earth. He sensed the creatures in their nests. He felt the current beyond the horizon. He felt the pulse deep beneath the mountain. He was a part of it now, not a prisoner, not a guest, a part of it. They reached the bottom by evening. The fortress was visible from afar, smoke from a bonfire, the light of torches on the walls, voices. Someone was laughing. Finn was telling yet another story. They approached the gate. Ha-yoon was standing at the entrance. She had been waiting all day. Do-hyun looked at her. She looked at him. Then she saw something in his eyes. Not words, not an explanation. Something else. She stepped forward and took his hand. She just took it, silently. He squeezed her hand. They went inside. The bonfire was burning. People were sitting around it. Everyone turned to look. Do-hyun stood by the fire with Ha-yoon on one side and Yuna on the other. He didn't give a speech. He didn't announce anything. He simply sat down in his spot. He took out of the workshop the piece he'd been working on yesterday, a bone buckle for Grant's belt. Grant had torn his belt that morning and had been walking around holding up his pants with his hand. Do-hyun sat down by the fire and began shaping the buckle on a stone. Ha-yoon sat down next to him. Silently, she placed a cup of water beside him. Emily moved closer with her notebook. Ji-min leaned over from a branch and looked down. Annabeth grumbled from her corner, telling him not to linger because she wanted to show him the crack in the clamp tomorrow. Kat sat against the wall, cleaning her saber. Yuna settled into her spot at the edge of the light. She took out a comb and began brushing her hair. The campfire crackled. The stone scraped against the